Hello everyone, this is What If Fanfic and today I'll bring you What If Naruto was sent to Games of Thrones. The link to the story will be in the description. If you want to hear a fanfiction please comment down below. Now on to the story.
Naruto Uzumaki stared at his opponent apathetically. Across from him, on the other side of the river, Sasuke Uchiha stood, snarling and glaring at him with his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan active in one eye, the Rinnegan in the other. "Why won't you die?" the black-haired man roared at him from across the river. "How much do I have to take from you before you give up? Since when have I ever given up?" Naruto asked with a wry smile, heedless of black electricity surging along Sasuke's arm. "And you really shouldn't be that surprised. After all, you know the old saying. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times. His eyes flickered over to Sasuke. "I'll beat your ass to death with a socket wrench." He looked up at the sky for a few moments, before barking out a laugh. "What's so funny?" "Oh, I just realized something," he replied, chuckling humorlessly for a few seconds more. Sasuke gritted his teeth in rage as the air around him began to thrum, uncontrolled chakra leaking from his body. "All right, relax, duck butt," Naruto said, waving him off. "I just realized, this all seems so familiar, doesn't it?" Sasuke spared a glance at the surroundings. Piles of rubble stood everywhere. Craters were smashed into the ground, while any trees or bushes still in the vicinity were either half dust or on fire. A giant stone head, once attached to an equally large statue, looked at both of them. Madara Uchiha's severed head, the irony wasn't lost on him. "It's funny because I was actually wondering something similar," Naruto chuckled. "How many times do I have to stop you before you finally learn something?" He raised his arms, looking around. "This is what happens. This is what has always happened. We trade some blows, fling a few techniques, insult each other, do the exact same thing all over again." Naruto turned back to his former friend, his smile fading. "Only this time, you took something from me that can't be replaced. And here we stand again." Naruto looked down at his bandage-wrapped fist, and it slowly tightened. "And I'll be the one leaving after this battle has ended, not you." "Don't count on it," Sasuke ground out through gritted teeth. "I've learned something new since I've been away. Maybe with my new technique you'll finally learn how to die. Really now, come on then," Naruto said, holding a hand, nature chakra mixing with demonic energy in his hand, condensing into a swirling sphere. The ground cratered where they had stood as both men charged at each other, moving so fast they would have appeared invisible to anyone watching. Chidori. Rasengan. It was as if a star had been born where their techniques clashed. Sasuke was sent flying, propelled so fast that the air around him caught on fire. By the time he'd finished skidding across the ground, there were very few bones in his body that remained unbroken. As he lay at the end of the trench he dug into the ground, coughing up blood and trying to make his useless limbs work, a shadow appeared above him, obscuring the sun. Naruto glared down at his last friend and oldest enemy, heedless of the blood that flowed from his left eye and the burns that trailed up his right arm. "You told me you would make me suffer, and you succeeded," he said, a current of rage beneath his otherwise calm tone. He lifted his leg and brought his foot down, directly on the shattered remains of Sasuke's knee. A strangled yell escaped the man's throat as his pain grew all the greater. Slowly, Naruto bent down to look directly into his friend's eyes, his own becoming dark with rage. "I hope you don't mind if I return the favor." He lifted his foot again, and brought it down again. Knowing his future would be painful and short if he didn't do something, Sasuke opened his eyes and used the last technique available to him. With a growl, he glared up at his best friend, turned greatest enemy. With the Sharingan he'd stolen from their shared teacher, he uttered the technique's name. Kamui. Even as Naruto's fist drove into the ground through his skull, it was already too late. The space around the last Hokage began to spin into itself, dragging him to somewhere he might not be able to escape. And rage swept through him again as he saw the final glimpse of Sasuke, who'd spent his final moment on one last act of spite. And the dark, foul chakra of the 10-tailed beast bled from his form, melting the flesh from Sasuke's bones even as it mixed with the chakra sustaining the teleportation technique and twisting its purpose, altering time as well as space. And Naruto Uzumaki disappeared from the elemental nations forever. When I woke up, I was in a different place, and I was 6 years old again. 6 years old. What the hell, right. I saved a man who called himself Eddard Stark, which was a weird name, by the way, from an ambush. He was fighting against the Targaryens with his friend Robert Baratheon, and they had started a rebellion against the Mad King, Aerys Targaryen. I honestly had nothing better to do, so I helped them out a bit, always using but a fraction of my power. The rebellion ended a little while later when Jaime Lannister shoved his sword through the Mad King's back, killing him and ending the rebellion. By then, I was a hero in the eyes of the people, thanks to my actions in dozens of battles against the Targaryens. My skills and magical powers became the subject of many songs and poems, much to my chagrin. Then, 6 years later, a moron named Balin decided to start his own rebellion, so I went and knocked over a few castles again. The mountain Pike stands on still has a few chunks missing. What? I was annoyed. Stupid Ironborn interrupted my nap. Anyway, after that was done, I was tired of all the fighting. So, I settled down in Winterfell, Ned Stark's castle in the north, and lived there. Since I was a few years older than Robb Stark, Ned's oldest son, I helped to raise him and all of the children that came after him. This is how this next story begins. Bran pulled back on the string of his bow, trying to hold it steady as he aimed it at the target. He was in the courtyard of Winterfell, surrounded by his older brothers, Robb Stark and Jon Snow, and his younger brother Rickon Stark. He let the arrow fly. It slammed into a barrel 5 feet away from the target. "Go on," Jon said, putting his hands on Bran's shoulders. "Father's watching." "And your mother." The boy looked up behind him to see his mother and father, Catelyn and Eddard Stark, looking down at him, his mother with a slight smile, his father with a serious face. He pulled on the bow again, struggling to keep it steady, and shot. This time, it overflew and went straight into the bushes beyond the wall. Robb turned away, smiling, as Jon chuckled. "And which one of you was a marksman at 10? Came the serious voice of Ned Stark from above, and they all stopped laughing, but continued to smile. Ned nodded to his second youngest son. "Keep practicing, Bran. Go on." The boy nodded and drew another arrow. "Don't think too much, Bran," Jon said from beside him. "Relax your bow arm," Robb advised. Before Bran could shoot the arrow, another one flew past him into the target. They all turned to see Arya Stark, Ned's youngest daughter and second youngest child, holding a bow in her hand. She grinned and gave a curtsy. Before Bran could do anything, a knife embedded itself into the center of the target, slicing Arya's arrow clean in half. "To answer your question, Ned, I was a marksman at 10, a playful voice came, and they turned to see their blonde and blue-eyed teacher, Naruto, who was smiling as he hung upside down over Arya, his feet sticking to the ceiling. He dropped down next to her and flicked her on the forehead with his index finger, earning a small yelp of pain. "Never get cocky, Arya. There's always someone out there better than you," he said, earning a slight glare from the young girl, which turned into a rueful grin. Ned smiled as he looked down at the man below him. Naruto was barely older than Robb, yet he was one of the most amazing and interesting people the Warden of the North had ever met. He'd been 6 when he'd saved Ned from an ambush, catching the Targaryen soldiers from behind and dispatching them with an ease that was unnatural for his age. Ned had taken the boy with him, and he had proven himself again and again that he was more than a match for any opponent that crossed his path. The boy was as mysterious as he was good with weapons, never talking about his past or where he came from. He became famous in the war for saving Cersei, Tywin Lannister's daughter, from a group of Targaryen sellswords. Then later, Ned had received a message from King Robert that the Greyjoys were in rebellion. He of course called his bannermen to his side and marched to support the king, as was his duty. However, both armies had arrived only to find several castles that had been destroyed already and one very irate blonde who was tearing pieces out of the side of the islet the great keep of Pike was standing on. When the rebellion came to an end, Naruto had decided to come with Ned to the north, to Winterfell, and stay there. He'd always seemed like he'd seen too much for his age, and was defiantly more mature than most of the boys the Stark patriarch had seen. He helped Ned raise his children, always treating them like they were all equal in his eyes, even the girls, Jon, Ned's bastard, and Theon Greyjoy, Ned's ward. All of the children, especially Sansa, Jon and Arya, had come to admire him, and he even suspected that his eldest daughter may be more interested in Naruto than even she knew. The blonde, of course, was completely oblivious to this, considering the fact that he was never very experienced when it came to girls. His good mood was ruined when Sir Roderick came up from behind him with a message. "Lord Stark, milady, a guardsman just came in from the hills. They've captured a deserter from the Night's Watch," he said. Ned became serious again at this news. "Get the lads to saddle their horses." "Do you have to?" Catelyn asked. He swore an oath. "Cat," he said. "Law is law, milady," Roderick added. Ned looked up at him. Tell Bran he's coming too. Ned, Catelyn said. 10 is too young to see such things. He won't be a boy forever, the Stark said grimly. And winter is coming. Why are you Northerners all so serious? Naruto said from behind them, and they saw that the blonde was crouched, balancing on the railing easily. There's no need to be all dark and dreary all the time. Seriously, Ned, how many times have I told you to lighten up a little? One too many, Ned grumbled, bringing smiles to everyone's faces. Anyway, I'm going hunting. The stock of wild boar has gotten a bit low, and you never know when we could use some more, Naruto said. Do you mind, Roderick? Not at all, we could always use more meat. Awesome. Tell me how the execution goes, the blonde said jovially, before jumping up and climbing past them up onto the roof. I'll never understand how he's so cheerful all the time, what with everything he's seen, Ned stated, shaking his head. Naruto whistled a tune as he ran along the rooftops of Winterfell, moving with a grace that few could match. Naruto, Naruto, came a soft voice, and he looked down to see Sansa looking up and waving at him. He slid down a thatched roof and jumped off the end, landing on his 2 feet a few meters away from the Stark girl. Hey, Sansa, what's up? He asked, and she blushed right down to the roots of her hair. Naruto had always been handsome, and the last few years had seen him grow considerably in that regard. He was tall and muscular, and ridiculously strong. He was also naturally tan, which was odd for someone living in the north. The 3 whisker marks on each cheek, as well as his oversized canines, gave him a somewhat feral appearance, though the whisker marks were somewhat hidden by the light growth of stubble on his face. Lastly, his left eye was always shut, the scar from an old wound stretched from his eyebrow down his cheek. His right eye, however, twinkled with happiness. Well, I was wondering when we're going to have our next lesson, she asked, cursing herself for stuttering. Naruto's smile widened considerably. The lessons she was referring to were something that were kept between them, though he suspected that Ned knew. When Sansa had been growing up, all she'd talked about was how handsome knights were going to rescue her when she grew up and whisk her away to their castles and fall madly in love with her. She'd always thought of herself as a helpless damsel who needed to be saved. Naruto literally beat this attitude out of her, encouraging her to stand up for herself, and began to teach her kenjutsu, or the technique of the sword. Since then, she'd grown into one of the most proficient sword masters in Winterfell. Even Ned Stark had a hard time beating her with a sword. However, the real secret was that Naruto was teaching her taijutsu, or the technique of the body. He was showing her many forms of martial arts, most of which were considered outright deadly. He always told her never to use them unless her life was in danger. Well, I'm going hunting right now, but maybe tomorrow, he said, and she nodded mutely, still blushing, which he didn't notice, thankfully. All right, see you later, she said. See you later, he said, smiling, and took off again. A few hours later, Naruto returned. He'd gotten a few kills in, most of them huge, and they were held in a sealing scroll in his kunai holster on his right leg. He walked through the gates of Winterfell, nodding to the guards. He came across Ned and Kat, both of whom looked grim, as well as Robb and Bran, who had 2 small pups following behind them. Hey, Ned, what's up? He said, walking up to the older Stark. He could tell that the Warden of the North seemed especially upset. Jon Arryn is dead, Catelyn said solemnly. Naruto grimaced. I'm sorry. The Stark patriarch acknowledged his words with a nod. Robert is coming up from King's Landing to Winterfell, he said, to which the blonde raised an eyebrow. Only one reason for that. I thought the same thing, Catelyn said. Before any of them could continue, the 2 pups ran up to Naruto and yipped happily. He crouched down and took a look at them. Hello, who are these little guys? He said, scratching behind the pups' ears, to which they responded with zeal. We found the body of a direwolf and 6 pups, one of each of the Stark children, Ned said. Including Jon, Naruto asked, looking up to see Ned nod and Kat look away. I'm surprised that they like you so much, Robb said. We only got them a little while ago, but now, if anyone tries to touch them, they'll snap and start biting everything in sight. I've always been good with nature, comes with being a sage, he blonde said, giving a final pet to the 2 pups before standing up. In the meantime, I have some food to deliver, and then I've got to get started on the feast. The feast, Ned said, raising an eyebrow. We're having a feast, Kat asked, looking at Ned, who shook his head, indicating that he hadn't known of any special event planned. Of course we're having a feast. Nothing beats a bad mood like good food, the blonde said, rubbing his hands together. I'll make this one extra special. Before any of them could protest, he was already running towards the kitchens. Ned rubbed his eyes and sighed tiredly. I'll never get used to that one. It was a little over a month later that King Robert finally arrived. Bran stared in excitement at the long procession of horses and carriages coming towards Winterfell along the road. He turned around and began climbing down the tower with skill. Below him, Catelyn Stark walked through the gates to see Bran's direwolf, who he still hadn't found a name for yet. Gods, but they grow fast, she said. She followed the wolf's gaze to see Bran climbing down the side of the tower. Brandon, she said sternly. He turned to her excitedly. I saw the king, he said. He's got hundreds of people. How many times have I told you, no climbing? But he's coming right now, the boy said, jumping down from the roof to land on his feet. Down our road, he's right, you know, said a voice, and they all looked up to see Naruto, standing perpendicular to the building, his feet sticking to the stone. The king's coming, so we'd better be ready. Good grief, Naruto, is there anything you can't do? Cat said. Don't really know yet, he said, and fell down, landing easily in front of them. You should all go get ready, Robert'll be here soon. Of course, Cat said, before turning to Bran. Now run and find your father. Tell him the king is close. Bran smiled and ran off, his direwolf following him. You really shouldn't encourage him to climb, you know, she said to Naruto, who shrugged. Bran's good at it, I mean, really good. He's probably almost as good as I was when I was his age, and I tend to encourage natural talent, he said, and Catelyn raised an eyebrow. Is that so? She asked. Oh, yeah, so he should be safe. And even if he's injured, I'll fix him up, he said, smiling and giving her a thumbs up in his nice guy pose. The Lady of Winterfell rolled her eyes, but a slight curve of her lips showed her amusement. Go find Arya, knowing her, she'll be running around up to mischief, she said, to which Naruto smiled. Ah, my little apprentice, he said with happiness, wiping a fake tear of pride away before running off. Meanwhile, said apprentice was squeezing through a bunch of people, trying to catch a glimpse of the king's procession. She was wearing a steel guardsman helmet that was a little too big for her, but she liked it anyway. She climbed on top of a cart and saw the first rank of horses, but was stopped from seeing more when Naruto appeared next to her. Hey, Arya, your mum's worried about you, he said. Mum's worried, she snorted. Mum's always worried, that's just a sign that she loves you, he said, smiling, and flicked her on the nose, shooing her towards the castle. Go on, Arya grumbled, but complied and ran towards the keep, rubbing her nose as she went. A little while later, she ran to get towards her place in the front line of welcomers but was stopped by Ned Stark. Hey, what are you doing with that on? He said, gripping her by the arm lightly before pulling off the helmet and handing it to Sir Roderick. He pushed her towards the end of the line in between Sansa and Bran. Move, she said to Bran, who scooted aside. His younger sister took her place in line. Where's Naruto? Ned asked, and Catelyn shrugged. I sent him to fetch Arya, but he's not here with her, she said. They stopped talking as said blonde walked over and gave them a nod, before standing at the back of the ranks, out of sight. He'd shaved in the few days before the king was due to arrive, so his face, aside from the scar and the whisker marks, was bare. The entire populace of the courtyard seemed to straighten as the procession trotted in on their horses. The first person of interest was Joffrey, the crown prince. He was thin, had blonde hair and green eyes, and held an arrogant and self-satisfied smirk on his face. He seemed to pay particular attention to Sansa, who returned his smile with more than a bit of reluctance. Next was a large figure on a horse. A helm shaped like a snarling dog's head sat on his shoulders, and he pried it open a little, revealing a bit of his face. It was Sandor Clegane, the Hound. Behind him came the royal carriage, and then came King Robert, who was surrounded by the Kingsguard. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Robert had really gotten pudgy. Everyone kneeled as he got down from his horse and approached Eddard Stark. Stopping in front of him, the king made a small, up, motion with his hand, and Ned rose, followed by everyone else. For a second they stood, examining each other. Then Ned inclined his head. Your Grace. Robert narrowed his eyes a little. You got fat, he said. Most of the Starks glanced at Ned to see what his reaction would be. Naruto, meanwhile, had to bite his knuckle to keep from cracking up. Ned just looked down at the king's ample belly and raised an eyebrow. They both started laughing and embraced each other in a hug, grinning all the while. Cat, the king said, giving the Lady of Winterfell a kiss on the cheek. Your Grace, she replied, and he ruffled Rickon's hair, before turning back to the Warden of the North. Oh, 9 years, Robert said, why haven't I seen you, where the hell have you been? Guarding the North for you, Your Grace, Ned said, smiling. Winterfell is yours. Naruto, meanwhile, noticed that the Queen, Cersei Lannister, was descending from the carriage. She seemed to be looking for someone amongst the crowd. King Robert went and talked to several of the children, namely Robb, Sansa, Arya and Bran, then looked around. Ned, where's that blonde boy that always followed us around and won most of my battles? The king asked. I liked him, he was funny. I would like to know where he is as well, came the soft voice of the Queen, and Robert looked back at her in surprise. You would, she fixed him with a cold stare. He did save my life once before. I would like to see him again and thank him. Ned turned back to where he'd seen Naruto, only to find that the blonde had vanished. He was just there, the Lord of Winterfell said. I don't know where he went. He went around, came a cheerful voice, and they all turned around to see Naruto just as he snatched the helm off a Kingsguard's head. The Kingsguard soldier happened to be Jaime Lannister, Cersei's brother, who blinked at the loss of his helmet. Huh, nice metal work. Who made these? I'd like to talk to him, Naruto said, completely ignoring the people surrounding him, while he flicked the metal of the helmet. He might be able to make some new kunai for me. Give me back my helmet, you scullion. Jaime shouted, and the ninja looked back at him, looking offended. Oh, scullion, is it? I'm a scullion now. What the heck is a scullion? Most of the people around the courtyard sweat dropped, and Naruto turned around to see the king chuckling quietly. He tossed the helmet over his shoulder to land perfectly on Jaime's head, who, at the sudden weight dropped back on him, bent forward a little. His arms came out and he made flapping motions as he tried to stay upright, and he gave an indignant squawk. Robert began to laugh as the mighty Kingslayer looked like he was doing the impression of a chicken, and even Cersei herself couldn't help but smile. Naruto came up to the king and they grasped each other's forearms. It's been a while, boy. You seem well, and you as well, King Robert, he answered. He turned around, to see Cersei looking at him with interest. He inclined his head. My lady, he said, grinning. Show some respect for the queen, you cur. Jaime said, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Naruto looked over at him with disinterest. If you're gonna insult somebody, then use words they can understand, he said in a deadpan voice. And besides, that's about as respectful as I can get. Even to your queen, another Kingsguard soldier demanded, his hand also perilously close to his sword. She's not my queen, Naruto said, then gave an apologetic look to Cersei. No offense, my lady. What do you mean, not your queen? Jaime asked, a second away from drawing his sword and removing Naruto's head from his shoulders. As if he could. I mean, not my queen. I'm not from around here, so I don't answer to her or Robert, he said, then glanced around at the white cloaks who were surrounding him, hands on their swords. Could you not be so threatening? They all stayed where they were, glaring at him, and then they loosened their swords from their sheaths. Naruto blinked. Okay, now I feel really threatened, Naruto said. Could you quit pointing those things at me? You need to learn some respect, Jaime said, and they all drew their swords. Naruto looked over at Robert, who seemed interested in what he would do. No one is gonna order them to stop. Really? He asked, then closed his eyes and sighed. What a drag. The 4 white cloaks all pointed their swords at him. The Stark family seemed on guard, but they knew how strong Naruto was, so they weren't too worried. Cersei was worried, but didn't interfere. The only one who was actually looking forward to the fight was Joffrey, who was paying close attention. Prepare to be beaten, peasant. Another Kingsguard soldier said, and this time, Naruto glared at him. Everyone could feel the sudden change in the ninja's demeanor. He was getting annoyed. Look, this is the last time I'm going to ask you nicely, Naruto growled, put the damn swords away or somebody's going to get hurt. Big talk, Jaime sneered, and the ninja gave him a disarming smile. I know, he said, approaching the Lannister. It is, isn't it? As he said this, his hands blurred as he snatched the sword right out of Jaime's grip, faster than the Lannister could blink. Before he could make a sound of protest, Naruto, holding the sword by the pointed end, grasped the hilt and snapped it clean in two. Everyone gasped as the sword, made by one of the finest smiths in the 7 kingdoms, was broken as easily as a twig in Naruto's hands. You broke my sword, Jaime cried, glaring at the other blonde with murder in his eyes. Naruto returned his glare with one of his own. If you don't back off, I'll break something else, he said, but before he could carry out his threat, Robert's voice interrupted them. That's enough, both of you, he said, but Naruto could swear that he saw a grin on his face. What, he started it, the ninja said in a childish voice, and Robert palmed his face. Enough of this, Ned, he said, and the Warden of the North looked over at the king. Take me to your crypts, I want to pay my respects. You too, boy. We've been riding for a month, my love, Cersei said, and Naruto could tell that she only added the last two words for image. Surely the dead can wait. He looked back at her, then said, Ned, and walked off. Said Stark gave an apologetic look to the queen, and followed Robert out of the courtyard. I also have something to do, Naruto said, walking past the guards, then up the wall. The people who hadn't seen it before were amazed by it, though Caitlyn was more annoyed than amazed. Naruto, we do not need you showing off in front of everyone. She shouted up at him, and he turned around in mid-step. Me, he replied with mock hurt. Why, cat, you wound me. I would never show off. The Lady of Winterfell merely rolled her eyes. Of course, and didn't the king ask to see you? Well, I have somewhere to be, but I have a solution for that. He put both hands together and made a cross sign. A puff of smoke issued next to him, and everyone gasped in surprise as what looked like another Naruto appeared next to him. The original leapt off the building and landed lightly on the ground, before walking after the two men, while the other continued walking up the side of the building and disappeared from sight. He's mad, Cersei muttered. He is. But that's why we like him, Catherine answered, smiling slightly. Underneath the castle, Robert and Ned walked through the crypts as they talked about Jon Arryn. Don't look at me like that, it's not his fault I didn't listen, Robert said, to which Ned gave a hearty chuckle. They stopped in the middle, and the king looked at his friend. I need you, Ned. Down at King's Landing, not up here where you're no damned use to anybody, Robert said. Lord Eddard Stark, I would name you the Hand of the King. Ned's eyes widened at the proclamation, and then he knelt down. I am not worthy of the honor, he said. Robert grinned. I'm not trying to honor you, I'm trying to get you to run my kingdom while I eat, drink and whore my way to an early grave. Damn it, Ned, stand up. As Ned stood up, Robert continued. You helped me win the Iron Throne, now help me keep the damn thing. We were meant to rule together, a note of somberness entered Robert's voice. If your sister had lived, we'd have been bound by blood. Well, it's not too late. I have a son, you have a daughter. We'll join our houses. Wow, big news, Naruto said from behind them. They both turned around to see him leaning against the wall, crossing his arms and smiling. He gave a pointed look at Ned. Told ya, you expected this? Robert asked, as the Warden of the North grunted sourly. Naruto rolled his eye. Of course I did, you're too fat and lazy to come all the way up here for just a social visit. I beg your pardon, plus the fact that Ned is your oldest and most trustworthy friend, there's hardly anyone else you could consider. What about you? Said friend spoke up, and Naruto looked at him confusedly. Huh, Ned rolled his eyes, a gesture he'd picked up from the blonde, and continued. Come on, Naruto, don't tell me that you are that naive. You've been Robert's friend for a long time as well. Yeah, maybe, but I don't really want all the responsibilities that come with the title, plus I don't think anyone would accept a 22-year-old as the Hand of the King. People younger than you have become kings before, Robert said with a grin. Why so hesitant? As Naruto tried to come up with an answer, Ned, wearing a smile matching the king's, continued. And besides, you've always been good with money. You managed to decrease expenses around the castle by 4% just this year alone. You could be useful in King's Landing. The only reason the castle is so well run is because I'm always the one that's running around and doing stuff. All the more reason, you should come with us. I think it's a good idea. As the ninja looked between his two grinning friends, he had the sudden image of a boar running around while two dogs nipped at its heels. Palming his face, he sighed loudly. All right, damn you, I'll go, just stop smirking at me, he said, walking past them, deeper into the crypt. Ned and Robert gave a few chuckles before following him. As they continued to walk, the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms became more and more somber. When they finally arrived at Tomb of Lyanna Stark, he was more melancholy than he had been in a very long time. Ned and Naruto stood at a respectful distance as Robert approached the statue of his one great love and laid a feather in her hand. Did you have to bury her in a place like this? He asked. She should be on a hill somewhere with the sun and the clouds above her. She was my sister, Ned replied. This is where she belongs. She belonged with me, Robert said vehemently, and reached up to caress the stone cheek of the statue, as if it would somehow react to his touch. In my dreams, I kill him every night. Naruto and Ned both knew the Robert was talking about. It's done, Your Grace. The Targaryens are gone. Not all of them, Robert said, grinding his teeth. Naruto raised an eyebrow as he heard those words. As both men turned to leave, he stayed behind for a second, looking up at the face of Lyanna Stark. Naruto gave a small sigh and rubbed his forehead. Damn. Later that night, while all of the others had gone indoors for the feast, Naruto had to fight to keep from laughing as Jon tried to keep him in a chokehold. They'd started to practice with swords on test dummies, or at least, Jon had. Naruto had mostly stood and directed not so helpful comments the boys' way. Finally, the son of Ned Stark had enough, and bull rushed Naruto. They'd started wrestling around, heedless of the mud that stained both their clothes. Jon struggled to keep his grip on the blonde boy, who, even in such a position, was still amused. For most, this would be one of the most dangerous things that could happen in a fight, but Naruto was literally laughing at him. Can't keep me down, Jon, he said between chuckles. I'll get you this time, asshole, he replied, tightening his left arm around Naruto's neck. However, the ninja been waiting for that. In a sudden move, he struck Jon's stomach with his left elbow, loosening the hold as the other boy gasped with pain and surprise. Then, he reached his right arm backwards and grasped Jon's neck, throwing him over his shoulder. The dark-haired boy landed on his back with an oomph, and Naruto grinned down at him. Looks like I win again, he crowed, even as Jon grumbled on the ground. The ninja reached down to help the boy to stand, who was now smiling ruefully. Guess I still need practice, he said, rubbing the sore spot on his back. Naruto just laughed. You always need practice, he said, and clapped Jon on the shoulder. But you've made progress. You're probably one of the best fighters in Winterfell. You can still beat me. I can beat anyone, so you're not alone in that. You're Ned Stark's bastard, aren't you? Naruto turned around and saw a small figure leaning against a wall, staring at them. Who wants to know? Jon asked, and the blonde gave a small smile. Years ago, calling Jon a bastard would have set him off, grinding his teeth and practically spitting. Now, though, he didn't let it bother him so much. Tyrion Lannister, the small man replied, walking forward a little, into the light. Tywin Lannister's son, Naruto said, and Tyrion raised an eyebrow at him. That's not how people usually recognize me, but yes, I am. Cool, nice to meet you, Naruto said, while holding a hand out for the half-man to shake, which he did, nonplussed. Not many people are so enthusiastic when they see me, Tyrion said. You must be Mr. Uzumaki, the one that my sister talks so much about. That'd be me, Naruto said, smiling. Then he paused, and frowned. She talks about me, oh, all the time. She's always been fascinated with the man who saved her life, Tyrion said, with just a hint of condescension. It gets a bit annoying actually. Well, my bad, Naruto said awkwardly, scratching the back of his head, while Jon had to hold in a laugh at his expression. Not a problem. Unlike most, I don't judge people for something that isn't their fault, Tyrion said, sounding serious for a second. But anyway, I'm going to spend the next 12 hours in a brothel. Have a pleasant evening. He walked off, leaving both of them blinking confusedly at where he'd been standing. Right, well, I'm going to go have some dinner to knock that image out of my head, Naruto said, giving Jon a lazy wave goodbye. Naruto arrived in the dining hall just in time to see Arya trying to fling a piece of food at Sansa. He lifted a plate and caught the brown sludge easily. Arya, Sansa scolded. She was cut off from saying more as Naruto raised the plate and flicked the food right back at Arya. She couldn't dodge in time, causing it to splat on her forehead. Naruto, the eldest Stark girl said, switching targets for her annoyance. He just laughed good-naturedly. Arya, meanwhile, who had been preparing for a full-blown food fight, was picked up by Robb for bedtime, who gave Naruto a quick nod. The blonde quickly returned it, before looking over at King Robert. An uncharacteristic frown came to his face as he saw his longtime friend, his single eye heavy with disapproval at the drunken and lecherous display the king was putting on. Taking a minute glance at Queen Cersei, he saw a blank and emotionless look on her face. Sighing with displeasure, he was about to walk out when he finally received the memories from his shadow clone. What he saw made him both gasp and blush, much to the surprise of several guests who happened to be near him. Naruto, are you all right? Sansa asked, getting up and walking over to him with concern. Why yeah, I'm fine, he said, turning and hastily leaving the room. Naruto hurriedly made his way across the castle of Winterfell until he was in his own chamber. He breathed a sigh of relief that no one had seen what he'd frantically been trying to hide. He looked down at the rather prominent bulge in his pants, and cursed the day that someone invented shadow clones. The blonde sighed for a while and gradually calmed down, but was still blushing at what he'd remembered from the clone. Fucking moron, he muttered angrily, putting his hands into the cross seal. Another clone appeared in front of him. I just want to take this opportunity to say, you're an asshole, it said. Eye twitching, Naruto punched it in the nose, causing it to dispel. Then his nose began to hurt. Son of a bitch. Naruto groaned as he woke up in his bed, rubbing the sleep out of his eye. Getting up and stretching with a yawn, he walked over to the window of his room and stared outside blearily. A bunch of his clones were outside, working on getting rid of most of the garbage from last night with a quick fire jutsu here and there. With a one-handed seal, he dispelled them all, and winced at the sudden influx of about 100 nights worth of information. He sat down on the bed again, processing for a minute. His clones, per usual, had managed to get into all sorts of mayhem while he was asleep. A dozen had gotten into a mud-flinging fight while still others had managed to have a 5-way duel with spatulas and kitchen knives. Several had annoyed the hell out of Jaime Lannister, while one had managed to get himself lost in the middle of the forest. Sighing at having missed all the fun, he stood up and shook his head, before getting up and walking over to the mirror in his room. Making several hand signs, he filled his mouth with water, and used a small fire jutsu to bring the water to a boil. Coating his gums with chakra kept them from harm as the water killed off any bacteria inside his mouth. Of course, he would probably have healthy teeth anyway, but an occasional rinse kept them from getting yellow and nasty. Spitting out the water, he looked up and saw his reflection. He slowly raised his hand before running it down the scar on his left eye. Sighing, he turned away and put on his clothes before walking out the door. He smiled as he was immediately bowled over by several of the direwolf pups, who were almost to the size of regular adult wolves. He chuckled as they licked at his face and poked around for treats. All right, you big balls of fluff, here, he said, pulling out a strip of bacon from his weapon pouch and tossing it to them. He watched them playfully fight over it with a grin. You know that you shouldn't spoil them like that, said a voice from behind him, and he looked over his shoulder at Ned, who was staring at the collection of direwolves with a soft look in his eyes. Yeah, but they're just so adorable, I can't help it, Naruto replied, scratching Grey Wind, Rob's direwolf, behind the ears. Anyway, what's up? Robert and I are going hunting in a little while. I was wondering if you wanted to come with us. Sounds all right, be there in a second. Naruto continued to play with the pups for a second, before he realized that Ned hadn't moved, and then looked back up. Something the matter? And no, nothing important, Ned replied, before turning around. Naruto blinked after him in surprise. It was rare when the Warden of the North stuttered. He must be thinking of something important. Then Ned stopped and turned back. It's just, I don't really know what to think of you anymore, he said quietly. Naruto's single eye regarded him evenly for a few seconds. Do you not believe me about what I said? No, I do, and maybe that's why. Ned, I'm still me, Naruto said with a small smile on his face. I'm still the annoying prankster you've always known, I'm just, more interesting. The Stark Patriarch's lips curled slightly. I don't think anything could change how annoying you are. Jackass, Naruto shot back, before they both chuckled. I'm glad I've met you, Naruto, Ned said. And I'm glad I've met you, Ned, Naruto replied, holding out a fist. The Stark looked down at it for a second, before sighing and bumping his own fist against Naruto's. I still don't see the point of that ridiculous gesture. You're right, I suppose only someone masculine would get it, says the one who doesn't even use a sword in battle. Well, you know what they say about guys with big swords, Naruto said, and wiggled his pinky with a grin. Giving the pups one last treat while simultaneously dodging a swipe from Ned's arm, he ran down the stairs leading to the courtyard with a laugh. A few minutes later Ned was on his horse, nodding to Theon as the boy gave him his gloves. Robert rode over to his friend. You as good with a spear as you used to be? The king asked. No. But I'm still better than you, Ned replied, and they both chuckled, before Robert became a bit more serious. I know what I'm putting you through. Thank you for saying yes, he said. I only ask you because I need you. You're a loyal friend, you hear me? A loyal friend. The last one I've got. Oi, Naruto snapped irritably, interrupting them. What am I, chopped liver? Robert sighed as Eddard chuckled in amusement. All right, one of my last loyal friends. I hope I serve you well, Ned said. You will, and I'll make sure you don't look so fucking grim all the time. Robert replied with a chuckle. Good luck with that, I've been trying to get Ned to smile for 10 years, Naruto muttered. Aren't you going to get a horse, Naruto? I can outrun any horse, why would I need one? Quote. Good point. Bran grinned as he ran around the courtyard, bouncing on the balls of his feet as he ducked and dodged around any obstacle in his way. He loved running, any activity that involved it, actually. One of the main reasons for this was a certain golden-haired ball of energy. Unlike his mother and father and most of his siblings, Naruto, instead of trying to smother his rather dangerous hobby, actually encouraged it, nurturing his desire to run and even showing him a few pointers. Jumping from a post to the edge of a roof, he underestimated the distance a little, and ended up scrabbling onto it with all the grace of a wet cat. He grinned ruefully. Guess I still have a few things to learn. Bran stood up and began to climb up the side of the tower, moving from one handhold to the next, aiming to get to the top of the tower in under 4 minutes, which was his previous record. Then, as he slowly made his way up, he began to hear voices talking from an open window near the top. As he got closer, those voices got more and more distinct. Then he started hearing words. Don't think we can do this anymore, came a distinctly female voice. What do you mean, darling? This one sounded male. I mean, I don't think that we should be together, at least for the time being. And why, exactly, do you think that? The male voice sounded angrier. I'm not sure, do you have any idea how stupid you sound, Cersei? By now, Bran was close enough to the window to look in, and what he saw was rather unusual. Jaime Lannister was currently arguing with the Queen and his sister, Cersei Lannister, who was looking both upset and unsure. Don't make this any harder than it has to be, Jaime. I'm not exactly happy at the idea either. Really, you seem to be perfectly happy to discount the fact that I love you and have fathered all your children. Does that mean nothing to you? Bran's eyes widened at the statement. Jaime was the real father of the Queen's children. If the king found out, he would have them both executed. Somehow, his hand must have slipped, or his foot caught on a vine, because he made a small noise. 2 heads snapped in his direction, looking for the source of the sound. Before he could get away, Jaime rushed forward and pulled him back by his shirt, holding him in the window. Raising an eyebrow, he looked out the window, down at the near 50-foot drop. Bran's direwolf was down on the ground, looking up at his companion. Jaime fixed a cold stare at the boy and said, "Quite the little climber, aren't you? How old are you, boy?" 10, he said quietly. He heard what we were saying, Cersei said nervously. Can you keep a secret, child? Bran nodded emphatically, still nervously clutching Jaime's arm. The oldest Lannister child smiled and slowly let go of Bran's shirt, then looked back at Cersei. His face slowly morphed into a grin. The things I do for love, he muttered, and with one hand, pushed Bran out the window. Cersei's eyes widened and her mouth fell open in horror as the Stark boy fell off the tower. She rushed over to the window to see him on the ground, his legs bent at awkward angles. She turned around, walked over to her twin and slapped him across the face as hard as she could. Damn and blast you, Jaime. What in the 7 hells possessed you to do that? She went to slap him again, but he caught her hand and pulled her closer to him with an odd smile. I did it to protect us, sister. You wouldn't want your dirty little secret out to the world, would you? When she didn't answer, he continued. After all, I would prefer it if your lovely head wasn't on a spike. At the bottom of the tower, where Brandon Stark lay, a small black mark on the back of his neck suddenly flared red. Leagues away, Naruto suddenly grasped at his head as a headache overtook him like a tidal wave. Ouch, Naruto, Ned asked, looking at him from his horse. Are you well? Naruto looked up at his longtime friend, his face serious. I am, but someone at Winterfell isn't. This hunt is over, but we haven't even found any boar. Robert whined, but he promptly shut up when Naruto gave him with an angry look. We have more important things to worry about than boar right now, Robert. He snapped, and everyone's eyes widened at the harsh tone. I'm going back. If you feel that killing a horned beast is more important than someone's safety, then stay. He turned away, his hand descending to his weapon's pouch, as he pulled out a strange 3-pronged knife. Then he reared back his arm and hurled it directly upwards, before suddenly disappearing in a flash of yellow. The blonde ninja reappeared in the air, grasping his knife and still soaring higher. One of the many things he'd done when improving on the Flying Thunder God technique was that if he threw something with a seal on it, notably one of his father's famous kunai. If he teleported to it, then he would travel at the same speed and in the same direction as the seal. That was something he'd learned the hard way. Actually, when the first time he tried it with a stick, he'd tossed it end over end. He'd teleported to the seal and ended up smashing headfirst into a tree. Yeah, fun. But that wasn't what he needed to focus on right now. That headache could only be brought on if the one who it was on was in mortal danger. The only problem with it was that it wasn't specific, so he didn't know which person it was. The only thing that he knew for sure was that it was one of the Starks. He threw back his arm and he felt the strength of the 10 tails surge through him. His eye turned purple and rings began to form. Then, his iris became even darker as Tomo began to form in between the rings. Hold on, he thought. I'm coming. Then, adding wind chakra and his own formidable energy into the mix, he hurled the kunai at Winterfell with all his strength. Robb was in the middle of sparring with Jon when all of a sudden, both of their direwolves began yowling loudly. What's that matter, you two? Jon asked, petting Ghost on the head. The wolf simply gave a whine, then both he and Grey Wind ran out of the training yard. Robb turned to his half-brother, who shrugged, looking as confused as he was. What do you suppose that was? Don't know. Let's go see what they're on about. Following the direwolves through the courtyard, Robb and Jon managed not to lose the two animals until they came upon what had upset them so much. They both nearly stopped breathing as they saw their brother, laying on the ground, his legs bent in ways they shouldn't be bending, his skin pale and bloodless. Before they could even think to rush over, an odd sound reached them. Turning around, they were greeted to a split-second view of a golden-haired person flying towards them, before he landed right in front of them. The brothers were knocked off their feet as the force from the impact rushed over them. Blearily looking up, the brothers saw Naruto, his eye a blazing red color, storming towards Bran. He lifted a hand and the Stark boy rose into the air. He took off towards the keep, Bran floating behind him. Making his way up the tower, he barged into Bran's room, startling old Nan who was knitting in the corner. Out, he said urgently, while two shadow clones popped into existence beside him and put Bran on the bed. One hurriedly began to work on setting the boy's bones in their proper positions, while the second's hands glowed green as he stood above Bran, healing the internal injuries. Naruto himself took up a position outside the door. It took a few minutes for Caitlyn to arrive and by then, Naruto was sitting outside the door, eye closed as he breathed slowly, not moving an inch. Naruto, she shouted, where's Bran? Let me in. Calm down, Bran's inside, and no, you can't see him, Naruto said with a frown. What? She shrieked. Why not? My shadow clones are working on healing him. Why aren't you with them? Because I can't use healing techniques, Naruto said. Don't worry, cat, he'll be fine. You promised me he wouldn't be hurt, the irate woman yelled and his frown widened. No, I only promised that I would heal him if he fell, he said, his flat tone warning Cat not to say anything rash. In true Tully fashion, she ignored the warning. How could you have let this happen? She shouted. He was supposed to be safe. You were supposed to keep him safe. Naruto gave a deep sigh and stood up, before looking at Caitlyn Stark, his single eye ice cold. Since you're not in your right mind at the moment, I won't hold what you're saying against you, he said calmly. But this wasn't my fault. Accidents happen. I will not be blamed for something that I had no control over. Kat's mouth shut with an audible clap as her mind caught up with her mouth. Swallowing as she realized how her words might sound to her friend, Kat just looked at Naruto pleadingly. Just make sure he's all right, please. He regarded her for a few more seconds to make sure the message had been received. He offered a small smile. No problem. I have a saving people thing, remember? Geez, I hate this job. You getting paid for this, boss? I wish. How is he? His bones have been set and I've healed most of the internal injuries, but his head got hit pretty bad. The dumb version of me is over there keeping the swelling in his brain down. Up yours. No fighting. We're trying to heal Bran, remember? Oh yeah, we'll get right on that. Naruto sighed. Dealing with his clones was hard. They were so annoying sometimes. Making a point of ignoring the hypocrisy of that statement, he sighed again and walked out the door to a worry-ridden Stark family. Bran's okay, he said, and they all gave a collective sigh of relief. His legs have been set, so when he wakes up, he'll be able to walk. But his head has some severe bruising. I don't know what he'll remember when he wakes up. Do you mean he might not remember us? His life? Robb asked. That's always possible, but it's very unlikely. It'll probably be a few hours of memory, a few days at most. Who's going to stay with him? Arya asked. I've got 3 clones in there, 2 are on standby and 1 is there to summon me in case of an emergency. He'll be fine. Can we see him? Kat asked. Yeah, sure, just don't get too grabby. His legs are pretty tender and my clone is still healing the bruising on his head, he said. And on that note, he walked over and slapped Ned on the back of the head. Ouch, there, now I'll always be able to get to you, wherever you are. Why in the 7 hells did you have to hit me? Felt like it. Fighting down the urge to strangle his now grinning friend, Ned just sighed and walked over to the bed. As they all passed by to see Bran, Naruto put a teleportation seal on each of their necks. With a little bit of cheer returning to his voice, he clapped his hands together. Now, is there food somewhere? I haven't eaten all night. A few minutes later, Naruto walked into the courtyard in time to see Tyrion Lannister slapping the hell out of Joffrey Baratheon. Do you understand? The halfman was saying. Joffrey, after looking shocked for a second, walked off, leaving Tyrion and the Hound behind. The prince will remember that, little lord, Sandor muttered. I hope so, Tyrion said. If he forgets, be a good dog and remind him. As he turned around, he came face to face with a bemused-looking Naruto. What was that all about? Oh, just teaching my nephew a well-deserved lesson, he replied, then sniffed the air. Ah, breakfast, Naruto asked, perking up, mind if I join you? Of course not, you seem rather amusing. Just amusing, I must be losing my touch, Naruto said with a grin, and walked after the Lannister towards the hall. Entering the dining hall, Naruto tuned Tyrion out as he saw the group at the main table. Jaime Lannister and Cersei, Myrcella and Tommen Baratheon were sitting at a table, eating their own breakfast. Seeing Jaime brought a grin to Naruto's face. His clones had left a little surprise in the Kingslayer's room the night before, and he had to hold in a laugh as Jaime scratched all over his body. Ah, the wonders of itching powder. Pulling up a chair, he sat down at the head of the table, to everyone's surprise, and pulled a chicken leg from a plate and began to munch on it. Howdy, Kingslayer, he said cheerfully. Have a pleasant night. Jaime glared at him balefully. You did something to my clothes. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, he said, though his grin said otherwise. You sir, Myrcella asked shyly. Not a night, dear, he said through a mouthful of chicken. What's up? Is Bran going to die? He swallowed and put down the chicken leg, his cheerful look dimming slightly. No, he'll live. Cersei looked up at him, her face blank. What do you mean? He's gonna survive. Not sure what he'll remember when he wakes up, but he'll survive and he'll be able to walk. That's gotta count for something. Myrcella heaved a sigh of relief while Cersei and Jaime exchanged a glance. It's no mercy, letting a child linger in such pain, the queen said. Well, Bran's strong. He'll pull through. Only the gods know for certain, Tyrion said, reaching for another bit of food as he looked up at his big sister. I must say, the charms of the North seem entirely lost on you. I still can't believe you're going, Cersei muttered. It's ridiculous, even for you. Where's your sense of wonder? The greatest structure ever built, the intrepid men of the Night's Watch. Turning to Tommen, he said in a playfully scary voice, the wintry abode of White Walkers. You're going to the Wall? Naruto asked. Are you thinking of taking that whole oath thing? And go celibate? Tyrion replied incredulously. The whores would go begging from Dorne to Castle Rock. Naruto snickered and pilfered a piece of bacon from the plate in the center of the table, munching on it with a contented sigh. Pretty awesome place, I've gotta admit. Bloody freezing though. You've been there? Myrcella asked excitedly. I send the occasional clone to check up there for updates, he said with a smile. They're always on the lookout. For wildlings, Tommen said. Not exactly, Naruto said cryptically. Can you show us a clone? Myrcella asked. He put down the bacon and put his hands together. Shadow clone jutsu, he said, and another Naruto popped into existence behind him. While being viewed with wide eyes by most of the occupants of the table, clone Naruto reached down and plucked the bacon off real Naruto's plate. Real Naruto smacked clone Naruto's arm, making him drop the bacon. Oi, hands off. But I'm hungry, boss. You don't need to eat. Don't be so mean. Real Naruto turned to his counterpart with a glare. Oh, you think this is mean? The clone popped into smoke a second later as Naruto's fist blew through its head. He raised his fist and blew the residual smoke off. The occupants of the table stared at him for a while. What? The chance to piss of the edge of the world seems like a minor thing compared to this, Tyrion said, looking fascinated. Children don't need to hear your filth, Cersei said and looked at her children. Come, Tommen and Myrcella dutifully got up and followed their mother. She turned around after a moment of walking. Naruto, would you walk with me? Sure, he said simply, and Cersei blinked. That was easy. 5 minutes later, the group of 3 were walking along a small path out of the castle and into the forest. Myrcella skipped ahead, as Tommen had chosen to go back to the carriage. I never got to say thank you, the queen said without preamble. Naruto looked over at her, eyebrow raised. You'll never have to. I have a saving people thing, he said with a small grin, which fell after a second. Which is so bloody tiring. What was that? She asked. Nothing, he said. Anyway, what brought this on? I've saved a lot of people. I saw that you were in trouble and I reacted. Simple as that. I just wanted to know why, she said. Why would you risk your life for me? It just doesn't make sense. No one else would have done as you did. Ned would, he replied with a small smile. He may not have my particular talent for rescuing damsels in distress, but he wouldn't have left you there. Ah, yes, the Honorable Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, she said sourly, and Naruto raised an eyebrow. What's wrong with him? Cersei opened her mouth to reply, but then shut it. Never mind. How do you think Bran fell out of the tower? She said, abruptly changing the subject. Accident, probably, Naruto said. Bran may be a hell of a climber, but no one's perfect. Cersei inwardly breathed a sigh of relief, was about to say something else when Myrcella ran up to her. Mother, I'm tired, she whined. We're almost there, dear, Cersei sighed. Can't you just walk a little bit farther? The little girl resolutely shook her head no, then turned wide puppy eyes on Naruto. Can you carry me, please? She said with her best pleading look. Naruto smiled, put his hands together. A clone popped into existence beside him and knelt. Hop on, yay, Myrcella said happily and wrapped her arms around the clone's neck. Giddy up, I'm not a horse, dear, he said with a smile. But fine, hold on, I can go fast. Myrcella squealed and the clone laughed as he took off in a decent clip, which stirred the leaves on a few trees they passed. Cersei looked after them, stunned. Robert had never done anything like that. He never played with any of his children, not even once. Too busy drinking and whoring, she thought angrily. Then again, she hadn't exactly been faithful to the relationship either. She shook her head. Now wasn't the time to think about that. I take it you like children? She asked. Naruto looked over at her with a smile. Shoot, I love kids, he said. Messy little fun-loving blighters. I can see you care about yours. This time it was her turn to smile. I do. I love all my children. Naruto's grin fell. Even Joffrey. She raised an eyebrow. Yes, why? Robert is not a very good king, he said idly, and her jaw dropped at the casual admission of her husband's inadequacy. Joffrey will be 10 times worse. What do you mean? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Naruto frowned. I caught him once in the kitchens when I was down at King's Landing. He was holding on to a cat and he had a knife in his hand, so I asked him what the hell he was doing, he said, having stopped walking. The cat was pregnant with a litter of kits. Joffrey said he was going to cut the kits out and present them to his father. Thought it would impress him. Cersei brought a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. He really did that. He tried but I stopped him. Long story short, I told him he was an idiot and smacked him about a bit. Though from what I've seen so far, he hasn't changed much, Naruto said with disgust. Joffrey has a sadistic streak as long as the narrow sea, and the fact that no one has bothered or been able to curb it is, quite frankly, troubling. No one in a position of power should be allowed to have that kind of bloodlust. Robert does, she said, but she knew the excuse was weak. Yeah, on the battlefield. Robert is a terrible king and one of the best wartime leaders I've ever seen. And believe me, that's saying something. But he wouldn't mutilate an animal for no reason. He doesn't kill unless someone he cares about has been killed. He won't hurt just for the pleasure of hurting, Naruto said. But Joffrey will. That's why he shouldn't be king. But he's in the line of succession. Naruto snorted. That's why I don't like the whole leadership deal around here and one of the reasons I do like Robert. He took the throne from someone who shouldn't have been king in the first place. Granted, he doesn't really do a good job of ruling, but it's a lot better than it was in the end for Aerys Targaryen. He knelt down and picked up a stone. Joffrey will be just like Aerys. Maybe even worse. At least Aerys was somewhat sane in the beginning. But Joffrey. He shouldn't be king. Honestly, he should be locked up somewhere in a padded cell. She looked at him, an unreadable expression on her face. And what will you do? If he hurts those you care about, what will you do? She asked. Will you kill him? Naruto sighed, and suddenly he looked tired. My only loyalty is to the Starks. I will not tolerate anyone harming them. Call it overprotective, call it stupid, call it bloody obsessive, I don't care. If anyone hurts the people I care about. For the second time in her life, Cersei saw why Naruto was not someone to be trifled with. The aura he projected when he was serious wasn't evil, per se. Rather, it seemed to be a warning. Mess with my friends and I will break you. She stared at him, thinking of what happened in the tower. You didn't answer my question. Naruto bounced the stone on his palm for a few seconds, both eyes closed. No, I won't kill him. I don't murder children. His fist closed and a thin stream of dust trickled out between his fingers. But that doesn't mean I won't beat the shit out of him. Then promise me, she said, facing him. Promise me that you will not kill Joffrey, no matter what he does. He stood up and opened his eye. I promise. Cersei looked at him, surprised, then thought of something else. You are surprisingly eloquent. What? I can be elegant. Eloquent. Yeah, that too. Cersei couldn't help it. She laughed. Naruto smiled. She had a nice laugh. He mentally slapped himself. Down boy, she's off limits. Seeming not to notice his sudden discomfort, she walked ahead. Shall we go? Yeah, just gimme a sec, he said and, making sure that she wasn't looking, gathered power in his legs and jumped. Granted he wasn't trying to reach the clouds, but he did go rather high. High enough to see that Winterfell was just a few hundred feet away. Landing lightly on the ground, he suddenly had an idea, and a grin stretched over his face. Oh, this'll be fun. Cersei gave a short scream as she was suddenly picked up by someone. She caught a split-second view of Naruto's grinning face before he suddenly jumped. She looked down and saw the trees speeding by below and realized that she was flying. They landed just outside of the main gates of Winterfell, where Naruto put down the scared woman. Then, that terror turned to anger. You ass! She yelled as she smacked him over the head. You scared the living daylights out of me. He smiled slightly as he rubbed the back of his head. Well, it was the quickest way back to the castle. I don't care, you dolt. Next time you pull a stunt like that, ask me first. He raised an eyebrow. Next time. Suddenly she looked unsure. Well, it was a little bit fun, I suppose, but if you try something like that again without my permission, I'll have your head on a spike. He gave a mock salute. Yes, ma'am, he said, not fazed at all by the threat. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have someone I need to go see. With that, he turned around and jumped back into the woods. Cersei watched him go and finally let a smile break through. What an interesting man. Far away, hidden in shadows, a pair of green eyes glittered malevolently. Naruto landed by a little cottage a few kilometers away from Winterfell, hidden deep in the weirwood grove. Only he knew about this place, he'd made certain of it. He walked up to the front and whistled twice. Another whistle answered, and he opened the door. He'd built the cottage to comfortably accommodate 3 people. A fireplace was there to keep the place warm. A shower with a heating seal was in a private room to his right and a kitchen was to his left. In the center was a simple king-sized mattress with a fluffy blanket, which he sat on, running fingers through his hair. Geez, what a day. Problems in Winterfell. He looked up with a sigh. You have no idea. Before him stood, at least in his opinion, one of the most beautiful women in the world. Long, silky black hair framed a face most women would kill for. Dark eyes looked down at him kindly. An olive-colored hand reached forward and cupped his cheek, running fingers over his whisker marks. Reflexively, he purred, and she giggled. Batting her hand away with his own, Naruto mock scowled. How many times have I told you not to do that? She giggled again and sat down next to him, leaning her head against his shoulder. But you're just so cute when you do it. But it'll ruin my manly image. No one sees us but you, Naruto. You've made sure of it. But I'll have to live with the shame of knowing that someone can make me sound like a cat. Granted, I have nothing against cats, but I don't want to sound like one. She smiled. Naruto was just too easy to tease sometimes. Well, I can't guarantee that I'll never touch them again, but I won't for today. How's that? He scowled for a second, then finally grinned. Oh, fine, I can't stay mad at you. Of course you can't. I'm too pretty for that to happen. Naruto barked out a laugh and laid back on the bed. Oh, man, today was hectic. Saved Bran's life, made sure he could walk, pranked the hell out of Jaime Lannister, talked to the queen. And finally, you've come here, she said, her smile having fallen a little at the mention of the Lannisters. Although, I think I know why. At this, Naruto sat back up with a pensive look on his face. Yeah, I think I do too. Suddenly, she looked unsure, and he stood up with a small smile. Why did you do it, Elia? I've told you 1,000 times, I don't expect a reward for helping you all these years. So why? Elia Martell, Princess of Dorne and former wife of the deceased Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, stood up as well and gave a small smile. Because I wanted to. He stared deep into her eyes, searching for answers, and not for the first time the thought crossed her mind that he saw more with his one eye than anyone else did with two. Then his eye closed and he sighed. All right, I can't exactly stop you, if it's what you want. A small amused grin graced her face. Oh, don't pretend you didn't enjoy it. He grinned back. Never said I didn't, he said cheekily, and she smacked him lightly on the arm. Then his face grew pensive again. Is Ashara okay with this? Both of you, I mean. Naruto, I owe you my life, but God's above your thick, she admonished. If we didn't want to do it together, we wouldn't have done it together. He nodded dumbly. Good point, he said, and she sighed. Speaking of which, where is our fearless companion? Oh, she's off hunting. Won't be back for a while. So we have the place all to ourselves, he mused, but noticed that Elia suddenly looked down and crossed her arms. She was remembering. He stood up quickly and drew her chin up so that she was looking at him. Elia, I would tear out my own heart before I would ever hurt you. You know that, right? The Princess of Dorne looked at the one person in all her life who was most precious to her. A single tear ran out of the corner of her eye. I know, but, with a smile, he reached up and brushed away the tear. Now is not the time for sadness, Elia. For tonight, let me make you happy. For a second, there was silence, then Elia drew him into a hug, which he gladly returned. Wow, that looked awesome, came a voice from behind him. He turned around to have a pair of lips press against his own. He returned the kiss with gusto. When the kiss finished, he stared into a pair of hauntingly violet eyes framed by dark hair. Every bit as beautiful as Elia, her pretty lips curled into a smile. You didn't wait for me, Uzumaki. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Well, you were gone for a while, so. She waved a hand. Ah, whatever, I'm just a little jealous of our mutual friend, she said, walking around him next to the thoroughly fucked Elia Martell and kissing her on the lips. She is rather gorgeous, after all. Don't sell yourself short, Ashara, he said with a smile as he tried to keep his manhood form popping off and flying around the room. You're every bit as beautiful as she is. Ashara Dane, former lady-in-waiting for Elia Martell, looked up at him with a smile. You really know how to flatter a girl, Naruto. Too much of that and I just might have to tie you down and fuck you stupid. He raised an eyebrow. You think you can? She raised her own. You think I can't? Naruto grinned and walked over, kissing her lips lustily. Let's find out. Naruto cracked his eye open blearily and immediately repeated what he'd been thinking for years. The son is an ass. He looked over to his right towards the kitchen and his eye widened. Speaking of ass, what was that, dear? A female voice asked sweetly, and he blanched. And nothing, Ashara, he said hastily, his eye tracking the ladle she held loosely. He'd seen her with that thing before, and had learned to fear it. Then he looked down again and he bit his lip. Holy crap, that ass. Ashara Dane whistled jauntily, lightly stirring the soup she was making. A light dusting of red came over her cheeks as she imagined the look on Naruto's face. Given the fact that she was wearing an apron, and nothing else, she shouldn't be surprised if he couldn't keep his eyes off her. She idly looked over as Elia entered through the front door and smirked as the Princess of Dorne turned red at her state of dress. No matter how many times it happened, Elia always had that adorable blush whenever Ashara was less than fully clothed. Elia, Naruto said cheerily and swept up the startled woman in a hug. I missed you, she simply sighed. He was incorrigible. I only went around the cottage to get some more meat from the deer Ashara got last night. Honestly, it wasn't very far. Still missed you, he said stubbornly, and she sighed again. Moving out of his embrace, she approached the kitchen and dropped a small bag of meat next to Ashara. What are you making? Bit of stew for us, she said brightly. Elia frowned at her. Never thought of you as a housewife. Ashara wasn't really the type of woman who stayed at home while the men did all the work. She was stopped from thinking more when the violet-eyed woman gave an unladylike snort. Bloody right I'm not. Who said I was cooking for Naruto? Elia blinked. I said us, as in you and me, we did all the work. Never said I was gonna cook for a useless lump. Naruto's face fell. The stew smelled really good. Then he grinned. Ashara gave a small eep as he wrapped his arms around her and nuzzled her neck. Please Ashara, I'll do anything you want, she smirked. Oh, really, anything, Naruto, he grinned. I bet you'll be only too happy for me to have stew after this. Oh ho, you think you can make me feed you? I know I can. Want to find out how? Sounds interesting. Will you two cut it out? Elia screamed, then blushed furiously. She hadn't meant to be that loud. Ashara turned to her with a grin. Ah, is little Elia getting jealous? She looked down and pouted. I didn't say that, no need for any jealousy here, Naruto said and kissed the princess of Dorne on the lips. This time it was Ashara's turn to pout as Elia moaned into Naruto's mouth. Bloody hell, Naruto, how are you such a good kisser? She asked when he disengaged, leaving Elia breathless and blushing. And for that matter, why are you so fucking good in bed? Naruto smiled slightly and reached out a finger, touching Ashara on the forehead. She immediately had to stifle a moan as a rush of pleasure surged through her body, causing her knees to weaken and her center to grow damp. He grinned broadly. My chakra is rather unique. Since I have so much of it in my body, I'm constantly emitting some from my, extremities. I've been told that it's very nice for any woman who chooses to have sex with me. You don't say, Elia muttered, still blushing. Naruto was ready to say more when suddenly a wash of memories surged over him, and his eye widened. Oh, crap. What? I forgot about Sansa, he said, panicking. I promised to be there for her next lesson. He ran out the door and disappeared in a flash of yellow light. For a second, there was silence. Did he just ditch us? Ashara asked, cursing under her breath. I think he did, Elia said faintly. Just like Naruto to get two women hot and bothered and then disappear because he forgot something important. Ashara frowned as well, but then smiled and turned to Elia with a gleam in her eyes. Well, I certainly know other ways to pass the time. Elia gulped as Ashara advanced on her. She'd smack Naruto silly when he got back. Sansa Stark tapped her foot impatiently. She'd been waiting for over 20 minutes, and was starting to get annoyed. A yellow flash appeared and Naruto skidded to a stop in front of her. Sorry, I forgot about today, he said hurriedly, and she raised an eyebrow. Oh really? She said, adopting a long-suffering look. And why, exactly, did you forget? Naruto winced. That was the tone Cat used when she was cranky. Well, that's kinda private. She huffed and hefted the wooden practice sword she'd been holding. Well, since I've been waiting 20 minutes, you don't get a sword today. He shrugged. Don't need one. Narrowing her eyes, Sansa stepped forward. Yeah, that might be true. I'm not really sure. Her sentence was interrupted as she swung the practice sword upwards, hoping to catch him off guard. Naruto idly tilted his head back, the head of the practice sword whistling past his chin with a scant inch to spare. Good. Attack when the enemy isn't ready. Spinning the sword around, she thrust at his eye, which blinked lazily as he sidestepped. Go for the weak spot. Or blind spot, as the case may be. This continued for a few minutes, Sansa trying to hit Naruto, who occasionally threw out helpful advice. Finally, a panting Sansa stopped, while Naruto just grinned, his breathing perfectly even. Good, you're getting better, she glared at him. You always say that. 'Cause it's true. Don't underestimate yourself, Sansa. That kind of attitude is unhelpful and useless. Her glare held for a second, before her shoulders sagged. Not much worse than me, then. Oi, Naruto said irritably, flicking her forehead with a finger. Don't be such a downer. Seriously, you've gotten a lot better. Rubbing her forehead, she finally sighed, before giving him a smile. All right then, teacher, start teaching. He grinned and sat down. After a second, she did the same. Well, since you seem at least adept with a practice sword, let's move on to the more interesting stuff. You'll never be the strongest fighter, you don't really have the build for that. But you don't need to be too strong, you need to be fast and precise. In less time than it took her to blink, Naruto's fist flashed forward and stopped a centimeter from her nose. Speed converts to force. If you get fast enough, you'll be able to hit really hard. Being precise helps to find the chinks in the armor, hitting where the enemy is weakest. She frowned. But if I hit hard enough, won't I be able to hack through armor? He shook his head. You can, but it's not such a good idea. Being precise is a lot more useful. Humans are delicate creatures. It takes less than a pound of pressure to cut skin, and a lot more to cut iron, to say nothing of the really hard metals out there, like Valyrian steel. If you can hit soft tissue, you're much more likely to win a fight. Besides, the weapons I'm thinking of giving you won't really be made for that sort of thing, the slicing and cutting. Her frown deepened. So I need to be precise? She asked, and he nodded. And quick. Your enemy won't wait around for you to look for a chink in his armor. They'll be hacking and slashing at you, which is where speed comes in. I've been training you to be able to dodge and swerve around strikes, and to deflect them if necessary. That's what the weights are for. She looked down at her ankles, where 2 strips of paper were attached. I still don't see how these are possible. He grinned. Those are chakra weights. The more chakra inside, the heavier they get. I've been training you to have stamina, speed and quick reflexes. Those are the 3 things that are most important to your safety. Naruto thought for a second, a bemused look on his face. Even after all this time, it still feels weird being a teacher. I can tell, she said, smiling, and he scowled. Alright, you've just earned yourself 10 laps around the castle. Shoo. Her smile dropped and she sighed. Some of Naruto's teaching methods left a lot to be desired, but she obediently got up and began to run. You'll never finish at that pace, he said, idly chucking a kunai at her back. She ducked with a sigh and it sailed over her head, impacting on a nearby wall and sinking almost halfway in. Sighing again, she sped up. Naruto's tendency to throw sharp objects at things that annoyed him was somewhat grating at times. Making sure she was running, Naruto got up and stretched, before jumping up to the top of the tower and looking around for something interesting to do. Ned, Jon, Arya and Sansa were all heading out on the King's Road today to head down to King's Landing. Ned's younger brother Benjen, who was the first ranger of the Night's Watch, had arrived the night before, and he had a suspicion about where Jon might be headed. Oh well, the little crow would probably flap around in the snow for a while, then get promoted and become all surly and crass like Jeor Mormont. Snickering softly at the thought of the old bear, he jumped down and landed lightly on the ground 50 feet below. What to do? He could hang around the kitchens, maybe work a little on the ramen recipe he was trying to finish, or find Jaime Lannister and prank the hell out of him. He could head back to Elia and Ashara. He smiled a little at the thought of the 2 women. Ashara Dane had been one of the first people he'd rescued in Westeros, saving her from jumping off a tower after the loss of her child. He'd given her a stern dressing down afterwards, involving many flicking fingers and several harsh words. Then he'd brought her to Winterfell and built the cabin. Later, during the sack of King's Landing, he'd found Elia Martell. His smile disappeared. Even after all this time, the anger still remained, and he doubted it would lessen any time soon. Sighing and shaking his head, Naruto looked around and his eye focused on the bunch of people getting ready to go. Ned and Robert, Cersei and Jaime, Tyrion, Joffrey, Tommen, Myrcella, Sansa, Arya and Jon. They were the ones going, while everyone else was staying at Winterfell. Oh yeah. Spotting the king laughing with a wineskin in his hand, Naruto opened his mouth. Oi, Robert, get your fat ass over here, I need to talk to you. The usurper of the crown, first of his name, king of the who sits and what sits, almost choked on his wine, to say nothing of his guards. I beg your pardon, hurry up or I'll pour itching powder in your trousers again. It was actually kind of surprising how fast a man of Robert's size could move when properly motivated. What was more surprising was the glare that was leveled at him by the one-eyed teen, who motioned to a door nearby. Having to squeeze in, Robert did his best to appear kingly, but Naruto's raised eyebrow told him that the blonde wasn't impressed. The room was pretty Spartan, only a single desk, 2 chairs and a painting on the wall of some previous lord of Winterfell. What's all this about, then? Robert sniffed. It's about you, for the most part. And don't look so bloody pleased, I'm not finished yet. You've been letting things go to shit, Naruto. Shut up, the blonde said shortly. I'm pissed off right now, so I thought we'd have a chat. Particularly about your son. Robert blinked for a few seconds, then sniffed and raised an eyebrow. Tommen, he's a fine young. A sharp smacking sound echoed through the room as Naruto slammed his palm on the desk, his right eye simmering as he glared at the king. I am really not in the mood for this right now, Robert. Taking a deep breath to calm himself down, Robert sagged a little and nodded. What is it? Take a wild guess. Joffrey, among other things. But for now, let's start with him, Naruto said, sitting down in the chair and folding his hands together, his index fingers sticking up and tapping his nose, while Robert remained standing. You've seen how he acts. He's a vile, arrogant, cruel, bloodthirsty little jerk. Robert narrowed his eyes and drew himself up, glaring down his nose at the blonde who was a good 6 inches shorter than him and currently sitting. You are speaking about the crown prince, Naruto. The shinobi, utterly unimpressed, crossed his arms. I am speaking about a jumped up little shit who thinks that because his daddy's fat ass is on the throne that the world belongs to him. I told Cersei and I'll tell you, Joffrey doesn't belong with any seat of power whatsoever, least of all the highest in Westeros. Robert blinked, then glared at his friend. You talked to my wife. Naruto stood up and glared right back. For your information, nothing like what you're thinking of occurred. It was a talk, nothing more. And given how you've been acting, I'm surprised you even have the balls to be angry about it, but I'll get to your display later. How could you let your son grow up like that? With that viper whispering in his ear, I'm not surprised he turned out the way he did. Robert growled, pacing around. She poisons his every thought, encouraging loyalty only to her and the Lannisters. The shinobi gave a short, harsh laugh. Cammy, can you hear yourself? That viper that you're talking about happens to be the woman you swore to love and remain faithful to, as good as that turned out. And also, I've met her, you asshole. She's nice, if a little sharp-tongued at times. Naruto drew back inside, pinching the bridge of his nose. Robert, you're my friend, but you are being such a little brat. Stop blaming everyone else and take some damn responsibility for once in your life. If you had actually tried to be a father to your son, or to any of your children for that matter, how different would you think things would be? I'm not in the habit of bemoaning my lot in life, Robert growled, and Naruto raised an eyebrow. Clearly, all those women and all that booze is a completely healthy habit and is not at all related to losing the love of your life, he said sarcastically. Robert stopped pacing and turned to his friend, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare bring her into this. Naruto breathed through his nose as his eye momentarily flickered to a dark, angry purple. You lost Lyanna Stark, the only person you were ever willing to change for. That sucks, but it is what it is. Stop punishing yourself and everyone else around you. The king gritted his teeth and crossed his arms. I hate that phrase. Naruto leaned over the desk, his weight on his fists. It is what it is. Stop it. Make me. It is what it is. I swear to the mother, Naruto, if you don't stop. It is what it is, the blonde said slowly, daring the king to do something. Snorting like an angry bull, Robert then sat down in the chair heavily. He closed his eyes and looked like he was thinking a lot, then stopped and sighed. Right, what, you're right, the king almost shouted, before he sagged into the chair, looking exhausted. You're right, I've been doing everything but what I should be. You can say that again, Naruto said, giving one last glare before sighing and sitting down as well. You and I both know that you were never going to be a good ruler, Robert. Your heart isn't in it. You like battle, blood rushing, booze, women with no expectations. You're not the kind of guy who likes responsibility, and you're all around pretty lazy. Robert looked at him flatly. Thank you for pointing all that out. You're quite welcome. The king relaxed into his chair and closed his eyes. I dreamed for a while, you know. Dreamed of taking my warhammer out to the free cities, of warring and whoring my way through life. The sellsword king, how the singers would love me. You know what stops me? The thought of my son on the throne, with all the power and none of the morals. How could I, Naruto? How could I make a son like that? You didn't make him that way, Robert, the shinobi replied. I don't believe that people are born evil. Even if they are, they should still be raised by their parents to know the difference between good and bad. Thing is, you weren't there for Joffrey, and he's so desperate for your approval that he'd be willing to do anything. Robert looked at his friend, searching for answers to the entire situation. So what do I do? Naruto raised an eyebrow. The hell should I know? My world was a lot less complicated than this one. Groaning and putting his head in his hands, Robert sighed. Well, you've been absolutely no help at all. I try, Naruto said, his lips twitching, before he settled back with a huff. Things have gotten bad. The Night's Watch hasn't had numbers or support this low in centuries. The Iron Bank of Bravos is breathing down the crown's neck because of Littlefinger's borrowing, and most of the lords of the Seven Kingdoms are at each other's throats. So start acting like a king, or I'll kick your ass off the throne and make Ned take it. Robert snorted. He'd probably do better than me. Oh, he definitely would. He just hates politics. At least he'd make an effort. And also, I'm glad you're taking this so well, 'cause I was being gentle. Robert looked over at his friend. What do you mean? Naruto sighed and stood up, walking over to the door. As he put a hand on the door handle, without turning around, he spoke. I don't want to have this conversation again, Robert. You take a little time, sort yourself out, but sooner or later you'll have to start acting like a king and a father. The shinobi opened the door and walked out, leaving the king with his thoughts. Then his head stuck back in, and also, try at least talking to Cersei. You might find her less of a viper than you think. Walking outside, Naruto groaned and ran a hand through his hair. Sometime he understood how Shikamaru felt. Everyone was so troublesome. Spotting Ned and Robb having a discussion, he walked over. What's up with you guys? I'll be leaving in a few minutes for King's Landing, Ned muttered. Robb doesn't seem to think that it's a good idea. You can't trust the Lannisters, father, Robb said, exasperated. Those three siblings and their scheming. We've been over this, Robb, Ned said. If they scheme, they'll draw the attention of the real most powerful man in Westeros. Ah, thanks, Ned, Naruto said happily. That's such a nice thing to say. The Warden of the North blinked and looked over at him. I was talking about Tywin, their father. Quote. In that case, screw you, he said, his smile replaced by a surly pout. I'll only retract that when you admit I'm the strongest. Without waiting for a reply, he turned on his heel and walked over to the horses again. They both blinked for a few seconds, then sighed. Such a drama queen. It's hard to believe how vain he can be at times, Robb muttered, rubbing his temple. Ned agreed, but his lips curled upward nonetheless. Maybe, but he is still our friend, he said, looking at his son and clasping him on the shoulder. Come on, Robb. I have a kingdom to run and an obscenely powerful child to manage. It should be great fun. Looking up at the ever-cloudy sky above Winterfell, a Naruto clone had to stifle a sigh of annoyance, before turning around and sounding a massive war cry. The original Naruto had left a dozen shadow clones and one blood clone back in the castle to look out for the rest of the Starks who were staying, particularly Bran, who was still recovering. The blood clone, in the meantime, was driving the others up the wall with his endless taunting. He was basically an amped-up version of a regular clone. Since he drew power directly from the original, he was able to retain form permanently as well as eat, sleep, drink, bleed, and, as he liked to keep reminding them, have sex. This combination of bitterness and annoyance led to some subtle feelings of growing resentment that was currently bubbling up in the rest of the shadow clones. In other words, he was driving them nuts. Naruto caught the shadow clone by the face and slammed it into the ground, causing it to pop, even as a few more encircled him warily. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh as he rubbed the back of his head. Even for his normal clones, this was just ridiculous. So, he may have boasted a little, was that really reason to try to beat the shit out of him? He grinned. There was a surefire way out of this. Gentlemen, he said, can we please just go? Shut up, ya fuck, the clone who'd just taken a cheap shot shouted, before it tried to punch again. Catching the blow with a hand, he pulled the clone towards himself and gave it a nasty headbutt. Two more came at him from either side. He punched one in the gut and kicked the other in the face, then winced as he got the memories of both at the same time. Enough of this, he said tiredly, as he dispelled the remaining few clones, before rubbing his stomach and face with a groan. One of the problems with shadow clones was they transferred the sensation that caused them to dispel, generally pain. Grunting in annoyance, he walked past a couple of people who barely gave him a glance, far too used to his antics, and started up the stairs towards Bran's room. Pushing the door open, he was greeted with the sight of Catelyn sitting near Bran's bed. Her eyes were red and puffy from lack of sleep and sobbing over her son, though she was trying to concentrate on making a prayer wheel for the seven. Another one of his clones was standing near the bed, his hands glowing green. Looking up from the boy, he glared at Naruto, who held up a hand. His eye flickered over to Catelyn, and the clone nodded hesitantly, getting the message. Neutral territory. Naruto walked quietly over and put a hand on her shoulder. You all right? She didn't respond, so he took a closer look at Bran. A few fading bruises still remained on his legs, but all in all they were healing up nicely. He still hadn't woken up, but his breathing was slow, steady and strong. He sighed. Bran may have been okay for now, but it was Cat that was worrying him more. She hadn't moved in days, always staying by her son's side. And normally he wouldn't have a problem with that, had she actually touched her food and slept for more than 3 straight hours. She wouldn't help anyone, least of all herself, if she kept this up. Cat, you should really consider moving around, he said gently. Bran's getting better, but killing yourself with worry isn't the answer to much of anything, really. I'll leave when Bran is awake, she said shortly, not even looking at him. Save me from the stubbornness of redheads, he muttered as he ran a hand through his hair. Whatever, if you feel like having some food or something, let one of my clones know. And he disappeared in a flash. Appearing a few hundred feet away, he turned towards the giant weirwood tree on the edge of a black pool of water. He always came to the center of the godswood to relax, away from most everything else. Usually, Ned would sit near the white tree to clear his own head, but he had been heading south along the King's Road for the past few weeks. Traveling nearly hundreds of miles away from home was certain to make Ned's wife upset, never mind the fact that he'd done so after his son had fallen from a tall tower and nearly been crippled. All of that was certain to piss off anyone, let alone Catelyn Stark. Shaking his head, Naruto stepped forward even as he took off his boots, cloak and shirt, standing on the water's surface as he walked into the center of the pool. Sitting down, he crossed his legs, pressed his fists together and closed his eyes as he opened himself up to the nature energy around him. This was his favorite place in the castle, a greenhouse built by Brandon the Builder way back when in the so-called Age of Heroes of Westeros. It was a nice place to rest and relax. Naruto, Sansa and Jon walked into the glass garden, talking animatedly about the finer points of their different sword styles. He smiled. Being able to teleport from one place to another certainly had its benefits. They both stopped speaking when they noticed Naruto in the middle of the pool, sitting on the water. "Hey, what are you doing?" Sansa asked, fighting down the blush that was struggling to appear. He gave a large grin. "Gathering up natural energy, just a few more seconds in." There we go. The skin around Naruto's eyes turned to dark orange, his pupils having turned into bars as his irises turned golden orange. Walking over to the edge of the pool, he blinked in surprise as Sansa grabbed his face and turned it in several directions, peering at him from different angles. "Well, this is interesting. How did you change the shape of your pupils? How are your irises so gold now? And how did you suddenly get makeup?" He was smiling right up until the last one. Sighing, he suddenly felt a bit more sympathy for Konkoro. "It's something I do when I gather a bunch of natural energy into myself and balance it perfectly with my chakra. My eyes get like this and I become a lot stronger. It's called Sage Mode, and you can let go of my face now." As she did so, Naruto turned around, walked to the middle of the pool and sat down, heedless of the curious looks both children were giving him. Jon sighed, and, seeing no point to staring any longer, turned around and started walking back to the courtyard. Sansa, however, stayed. "Naruto, can I ask you something?" His one eye cracked open. About to speak, the young girl dithered for a second, playing with her hair as she tried to figure out how to say her question. "Sansa, I hope you enough about me by now to realize that I won't be offended by whatever you want to ask." She gave a small smile, steeled herself, and spoke. "Why did you come to Winterfell?" He raised an eyebrow. Stammering for a moment, Sansa tried to gather her thoughts. "Well, I mean, I've heard about what you did during the war and then the rebellion," she said, unsure. "Even now, the common people still sing your praises in the taverns." "Oh really? Been to many taverns lately?" he asked with a smile. Blushing, she threw a stone at his head which he neatly dodged. "You know what I mean," she huffed. "What I'm trying to say is, you had a choice. You could have gone to King's Landing, Castle Rock, the Reach, the Vale, or anywhere else. So why here?" "Ha!" he laughed. "If I went through all the details and nuances of why I decided to come here, we'd still be talking by the time next winter rolls around." "Then just summarize it," she growled, then subsided a little. "I want to know." For a few seconds he looked into her eyes. Then his smile gave way to a pensive look as he turned around to stare at the weirwood tree. "4 reasons. Reason 1 was your dad," Naruto said, putting up one finger while staring off into space. "Ned is a disturbingly honest ruler, and given what I've seen here, that's saying something. At the time, I trusted him a lot more than any of the other lords around, so I decided to ask if I could hang out here." He held up a second finger. "Reason 2 is a matter of economics." She blinked a few times. "What do you mean?" Naruto dithered for a second, then pulled a scroll from his pocket. Biting his thumb and swiping blood down the seal released a puff of smoke and several small, lumpy things were suddenly in his hand. "For example, do you know what these are?" She took one from his palm and looked it over. "Is it a plant?" "Hell of a plant," he grinned. "This is a potato." She waited for a few seconds, then sighed. "In your wildest dreams, could you have possibly imagined that I would have any idea what you're talking about?" He pouted. "Well, just go ahead and spoil my fun, why don't you?" "These potatoes," he enunciated, as she gave a discreet roll of the eyes, "are plants that are far better suited to growing in cold environments than wheat, barley, oats or rye. I've had teams of shadow clones out supervising a dozen farms for the past few years, with a yield at least 3 times that of the average wheat farm. That's helped Ned a lot cause he didn't need to break his back over finances and trade for extra wheat reserves from the Tyrells, he said, walking over to her and donning his shirt, as it seemed to be distracting Sansa. Third was so that I could implement more of my other ideas on a large scale. Something I noticed is that the society you're living is a lot less advanced than mine. We had dozens of technologies no one here has imagined, let alone actually created. Things like travel, smithing, mining, farming, education and warfare were way far ahead of anything I've seen here. He frowned for a few seconds as Sansa listened raptly. Her brow furrowed for a few seconds as she was reminded of something. Is that what Robb and Father kept talking about? I remember them complaining about the ground you dug up. Naruto smiled and stood up, brushing dust from his pants. Now, I want you to think carefully on this. Can you imagine me, a person from a strange world with knowledge and technology far more advanced than yours, actually being content with using chamber pots? He ruffled her hair and walked away, leaving Sansa pouting. She sat for a few minutes, thinking about everything she'd learned, when she suddenly remembered that he'd only mentioned 3 reasons. Poke. Stop it, poke poke, stop it, poke. Catching Arya's fingers in his hand, Naruto gave a half-hearted glare down at the pouting girl. Teach me, no. Poke, teach me, no, he said, grabbing her other hand. Teach me, she demanded, kicking him in the shin. No, he replied, completely and totally calm. She kicked him in the exact same spot. Gra, Sansa, come take your sister off my hands, he roared, startling the entire procession. The trip back down from Winterfell was now in its 4th week and being surrounded on all sides by soldiers and nobles was wearing on his nerves. Arya's constant attempts to annoy him into teaching her sword fighting wasn't helping. Even now, rather than being even the slightest bit apologetic, she was looking up at him with an expression that bordered on insolence. You're teaching Sansa, why not me? You said you would. I said I would teach you in 5 months 4 months ago, Arya, he growled in a tone that would make the toughest soldiers think twice before attacking. She kicked him again. Ow, knock it off. Arya, stop pestering Naruto, Sansa said amusedly. Years ago her little sister acting like this would have sent her into a scathing diatribe about how proper ladies were supposed to act. Now, it was just funny to watch the strongest man in the world get overpowered by a pouting 9-year-old. Here, come with me, I'll show you some basics. The brown-haired girl brightened immediately, and they both walked away. Naruto's eye twitched. Running his hand through his hair with a sigh, he started off towards Ned's tent. He could always get a laugh from hanging around the Warden of the North, even if it was only seeing his reaction when he looked in the mirror to find his hair dyed orange. He grinned. The most stoic men were always the best pranking targets. Pulling open the tent flap, he raised an eyebrow when he couldn't see his friend. Oi, Jory, where's Ned? The captain of Ned's personal guard, who was standing outside the tent, jerked his head. Lord Stark and the king are having lunch in the field south of the inn. Cool, thanks Jory, he said as he walked away. In the meantime, Naruto idly thought about Robert's behavior so far. He seemed to be taking less of an interest in wine and women at the last few inns they'd stopped at, which was good news in Naruto's book. Cersei had certainly been surprised, when, in one incident, rather than pulling a serving girl into his lap and giving her a drunken kiss, he'd thanked her demurely and sipped his drink. The evil eye promising a lot of pain Naruto had directed at him during that moment might have had something to do with it, but overall, things were looking up. He approached the pair, giving a small grin at the thought of what they might be talking about. Something serious, probably. Great big tits you could bury your face in. He walked into a tree. Ned and Robert both looked up to see Naruto trudging over, rubbing his head and cursing wildly. A wave of his hand had a tree sprouting from the ground in perfect imitation of a chair, which he sunk into grouchily. Having troubles, boy? Robert asked, both amused and unnerved by what he'd just seen. Don't ask. Ned, far more used to Naruto's strange powers, simply chuckled. My daughter's been getting on your nerves again. I get no respect from youngsters these days, he muttered, sighing. Anyway, you were saying something about tits. Robert brightened immediately as they got into one of his favorite subjects. Ah, yes, what was that girl's name again? Becca, Bessie, Ned corrected. Naruto goggled at him. Some parent actually named their kid Bessie. The other two chuckled, and a relaxed atmosphere settled over the table. A few guards, looking over the spectacle, realized that these three, despite any difference in status or opinion, were still good friends. sitting in comfortable silence and taken the occasional or, in Robert's case, frequent bite to eat, they merely sat, content with the absence of words. The king of the Who's-Its was content to continue eating, while Ned looked off into the distance with a half-smile on his face as Naruto sank down into his tree and closed his eye. However, it didn't take long for Robert to become tense again. "What's eating you?" Naruto asked without opening his eye. Without responding, he reached into his tunic and pulled a folded piece of parchment, handing it to Ned, whose brow furrowed as he read. "Daenerys Targaryen has wed some Dothraki horse lord, what of it? Should we send her a wedding gift? A knife, perhaps, a good sharp one. And a bold man to wield it." Naruto's face remained expressionless. "She's little more than a child," Ned protested. And sooner or later that child will open her legs and start breeding," Robert said harshly. "Tell me we're not speaking of this." "Oh, it's unspeakable to you. What her father did to your family, that was unspeakable. What Rhaegar Targaryen did to your sister, the woman I loved." With fire flashing in his eyes, Robert stared at his oldest friend. "I'll kill every Targaryen I get my hands on." "Nope." Both men blinked, then turned their heads to the third member of the group, who was smiling, relaxed. What do you mean, no?" Robert demanded. "Terribly sorry, Your Highness, I seem to have been unclear, somehow," the blonde replied, settling into his chair. "You won't be killing any Targaryen. Ever." Ned idly noticed a few of the lords and ladies of the procession starting to come over the hill, including the queen. Then Robert's shock turned to anger. "Who are you to give orders to me?" he roared, standing up. "This is not a matter that concerns you, boy." "Lives of innocent people do concern me, Robert," Naruto replied. "Especially when it's one of my friends who is going to end them. Are you telling me that you intend to allow Dragonspawn to walk free after what they did?" And then came the fist. Robert didn't even see it coming. 1 minute he was talking, the next he was on his back holding a bleeding nose, while a smiling Naruto stood over him, his eye darkening. A second passed, and the first of the Kingsguard got over his shock and drew his sword. Running forward with a shout, he raised his sword, preparing to cleave the blonde's head in half. Naruto smiled. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the man's eyes. The Kingsguard, Marin Trant, stopped in his tracks. Then, to the horror of those watching, he began to shudder violently as bubbles began to froth at the corners of his mouth. He pitched over backward in a dead faint, his sword falling from his grip. The rest of the soldiers drew their swords, muttering nervously and waiting for another to go first. Before any of them could move, Naruto began to speak. "You know, recently I've realized something," he said softly. "I've been too isolated. Everyone down south has been getting away with too much. I chose to hang out with Ned cause he's honest, but I should have faced all the bad instead of running away from it. I tried to operate by leaving those in power to their own devices, because generally, people can take care of themselves." He sighed, pulling a hand through his hair. "But I can see now that my decision was a mistake." Queen Cersei heard her fellow blonde speaking, and stopped to listen, worried. Naruto, for his part, lost his smile and began to glare down at Robert, who was still trying to staunch his bleeding nose. "For a while, I've been concerned with some of the things I've heard from that god-awful shithole you call a city," he said, frowning. "At least 5 million gold dragons in debt, the king constantly in his own room surrounded by drinks and whores, while constantly ignoring 3 kids he helped put on this earth." Rubbing his forehead with a growl, Naruto opened his eye, which was now visibly darkening. "Damn it, Robert, I went up to the north for a vacation. Not so I could come back a few years later and find out that the problems have multiplied while I was gone. We had this damn conversation barely 4 weeks ago." Leaning down next to the bleeding Baratheon, Naruto stared straight into Robert's eyes, his voice becoming steadily louder and angrier. "Consider this an intervention, as well as your last warning. If I hear you haven't been taking better care of your kingdom and yourself, if I find out you've been sleeping with anyone who isn't your wife, if I even think that you might be going after the Targaryen children, I'll fucking kill you." He turned on his heel and stormed away, walking up the hill, heedless of the fearful looks the guards were giving him. As he went past her, Cersei called out, "Naruto." He stopped and cast a glance over his shoulder. "Sorry, milady," he said, before looking straight ahead. "But right now, I need to go punch something." Crouching slightly, Naruto jumped, the ground cratering where his feet left it. It took a few seconds for the queen to see him to disappear among the trees. Cersei looked down at her husband, who was being helped to his feet by the Stark patriarch. "I told you, Robert, if you keep provoking Naruto, he'll eventually take things into his own hands. Now more than ever, you need to swallow your pride." I don't need to do anything, the bleeding king growled in impotent rage, turning his back on his friend. That sort of attitude is exactly the problem, Ned said sharply. For once, I have to agree with him. Like it or not, your lack of action is what's causing this. So what would you have me do, Ned? Robert shouted, turning back and glaring down at Ned. The Warden of the North and Hand of the King looked up at his oldest friend steadily. Rule, fuck. A few birds were startled out of their trees at the sudden yell, as well as the loud boom that reverberated through the forest. Naruto stormed through the woods, smashing apart any tree that was in his way. Damn it, he roared, a subtle shockwave emanating from his body, picking up debris from the forest floor and flinging it away from his heavily breathing form. He sat down heavily on the ground, pressing his palms to his head and trying to cool the energy running beneath the surface of his skin, begging to be unleashed. For a while, he stayed there, simply listening as the sounds of the forest slowly returned. He sat in the grass for a long while, feeling the sun beginning to bear down on the back of his neck. A small wind was blowing in from the north, carrying a light chill along with it. He could hear water, running over rocks. A stream nearby. What the hell am I moping around for? He growled to himself. Before standing up a little while later, he came upon a narrow river only a few meters wide. Crouching, he splashed his face with some water, then perked up as he heard voices. Arya, use your arms. Micah, move your legs. Downstream and across the river, Sansa was carefully critiquing Arya and her friend's performance in the mock sword battle they were attempting. Their movements were rough, but both had a fair amount of talent already. Ah, Lady Sansa, I was looking for you. She turned around and saw the Crown Prince, Joffrey Baratheon, slowly walking towards them, an ever-present smirk on his face. She struggled to conceal her sudden flash of concern. Curtsying as Arya and Micah stopped their practice, she forced a smile. My prince, I've been looking for you, he said. I was wondering if you had gotten lost. No, my prince, I've merely been enjoying the fresh air. It is much warmer in the south than I'm used to, she said, keeping a pleasant smile on her face. He suddenly had a distasteful expression on his face. Yes, the north is far too frigid for my liking. Can't imagine why anyone would want to live there. She carefully stopped any hint of the annoyance from showing at his statement. He looked around her to see the two other people standing there, and took special notice of the boy holding the practice sword. And what is going on here? We were just practicing, my lord, the stocky redhead stuttered. He's the butcher's boy and my friend, Arya proclaimed, glaring at Joffrey. A butcher's boy who wants to be a knight. The prince grinned, his eyes glittering, as he pulled out his sword out. My prince, perhaps this isn't, Sansa began, only to be interrupted. Oh, nonsense, Joffrey laughed, pressing the blade against Micah's cheek. I won't hurt him, much. Blood started to show from the cut, but before Arya could move, her direwolf leapt past her and buried her teeth into Joffrey's arm, causing him to drop the sword with a screech. As Arya tried to pull Nymeria off of the prince, Micah turned to run. Before he could make it 2 feet, he ran into Naruto. For a second, the air was filled with nothing but Joffrey's yells of pain as Sansa, then Arya caught sight of the blonde, whose usual smile was gone. Bringing a thumb and finger from his right hand to his mouth, he whistled sharply, causing the direwolf to release its hold on Joffrey's arm and back away, tail between its legs. Looking around, Naruto held a hand to his head and sighed. Case in motherfucking point. Idly pressing a glowing hand against Micah's cheek to close the wound, he watched impassively as the prince's pain turned into anger. Fumbling around for his sword, Joffrey glared hatefully at the direwolf who'd attacked him and raised his sword to slice off the monster's head. Before he could move, a hand of steel closed around his wrist, and he was wrenched around to face one of the most feared warriors in the Seven Kingdoms. His face changed from rage to one of abject horror. You know, so far I've had a pretty bad day, Naruto growled. I've been spent weeks surrounded by morons. I'm going to a place that literally smells like shit. I've had to lecture a drunken man-child on how a kingdom works, and now I find a little punk who I met a few years ago, doing the exact thing I told him not to do. Looking up from said punk who was struggling to keep control of his bowels, he looked at Sansa. Take Arya and Micah back to camp. Joffrey and I need to have a chat. The red-haired girl swallowed, then took Arya's hand and motioned for Micah to follow her, Nymeria following a few steps behind. And the two blondes were left alone. For a while, Naruto simply stared down at Joffrey, who was pale and sweaty, at least, more than usual, and was subtly trying to escape the hand still circling his wrist. I've done too many monologues today, so I'll try to keep it simple for you, Naruto said, not budging a millimeter. You can't keep doing this. Your death will come early if you try. What do you mean? Joffrey stuttered, and Naruto's eye hardened. The problem with you is that you like pain far too much. The last king who had that kind of mindset got stabbed in the back by the very person who was supposed to protect him. Joffrey drew himself up, and was still shorter than Naruto by half a foot, so settled for bluster. Why you think you can threaten me? I am. Naruto, eye darkening, slapped Joffrey upside the head. I'm educating you, you little prick. I'm saying that this path you're on knows nothing but bloodshed, and it'll probably end with someone spilling yours. Wrapping a glowing hand around Joffrey's arm where the bite marks were still bleeding, the ninja froze him with a glare. You will be civil towards everyone you meet on this trip, or I'll know the reason why. Naruto let the prince go and stormed away, leaving the boy to fall to his knees, holding his arm. Joffrey stayed there for a long time. Then he looked through the torn clothes at his now unmarked skin. Reappearing in front of a simple log cabin, Naruto opened the door and walked inside, still fuming. Coming into the living room, his hand blurred and caught the kitchen knife that had been thrown from his blind side without even looking. Elbow was out of alignment, he grumbled. Makes the blade hit slightly off target. Ashara Dane paled significantly at the realization that she'd just tried to kill one of her best friends. Gods, Naruto, I'm sorry, she stammered. He shrugged. Cause you tried to kill someone who entered without permission. I'd be pretty damn hypocritical if I got mad at you because you did the exact thing I've been training you for. But, he smiled, tension easing off his frame as he walked over and took her hands in his. It's okay, Ashara, I'm fine, and I really should have knocked anyway. I was just thinking of other things. She gave a half smile as he walked over to the bed, lay down and closed his eye. Only to open it again, when he felt a weight settle over him. Ashara looked down at him with a sultry smile as she shifted her body over his, her arms above his shoulders, her legs on either side of his torso. Sounds like you had a rough day, she whispered as she brought her head down to brush her lips against his neck. You have no idea, he groaned, bringing his hands to rest on her hips, feeling her smooth skin through the silk clothes. Well then, perhaps you could use some distraction, she said, leaning back until she was sitting on his lap, feeling his interest between her legs. Naruto grinned and flipped Ashara over until he above her, staring into her gorgeous purple eyes and giving her a roguish grin. Well, alright then, wow. Tell me about it. That was, sure, and that part, yeah. Naruto and Ashara lay down in the master bedroom together, tired and glowing from their latest round of lovemaking. Did you like that thing I did with my tongue? He asked cheekily, causing her to blush even more from the memory. Oh yeah, Tilda, she breathed as his arm snaked its way around her back to hold her closer, idly running fingers along the sides of her breast, sending tingles down her spine. Wanna go again? Give me a few minutes, I'm worn out, Ashara breathed, still wondering at how much stamina Naruto could possibly have. Said blonde smiled as he gave her breast a cheerful squeeze. Honk, he received a cheerful elbow to the gut in retaliation. Ow, the violet-eyed beauty sighed half-heartedly and pulled herself up, sitting on the edge of the bed. She stood up, paused for a second, then fell to the ground. Ouch, you okay? Naruto said hurriedly, shuffling over the bed. Ashara simply sat there for a while, shocked. I can't feel my legs. Naruto laughed nervously, scratching his cheek. Haha, yeah, I just remembered that I sometimes have that effect on women. I hate you so much right now, she muttered. Honestly, sometimes I don't even know why I am MPH. She was interrupted as he leaned over and covered her mouth with his tongue gleefully invading and staking its claim. Her eyes fluttered closed as the kiss continued, unable to believe Naruto's skill. They remained lip-locked for a few more seconds, before he withdrew with a smirk, leaving her completely dazed. That might be why, he said, as she growled angrily. By the way, do you know where Elia is? There's something I want to show the two of you. She's outside by the river, Ashara muttered. You go get her, I'll see if I can get cleaned up. Sure, he said cheerfully, pausing to kiss her again before beginning to put his clothes back on. A minute later, he strode out from the small cabin, smiling giddily. They were gonna enjoy this. Elia, he hollered, walking towards the riverbank. Got something I wanna show you. I'm up here. Walking through the trees, he glanced skyward. In the branches of one of the largest sat the Princess of Dorne, scratching away at some paper with a stick of charcoal. He grinned and began to climb through the branches until he was right next to her. Whatcha doing? Drawing, she replied, showing him the pad. It was an artful sketching of the landscape scene from the top of the tree. Looks nice, Naruto grinned, looking over Elia's shoulder. You've gotten a lot better at this. Better than you, certainly, she snarked, butting his cheek with her head. Well, I never claimed to be an artist, he replied. Master of the elements, awesome toad sage of the 6 paths of bad Asura, sure, but lover of the arts, I am not. She smiled half-heartedly. That's not true, you love listening to music. Music, sure, but I've never understood people who look at blotches of paint on a piece of canvas and try to pretend that they somehow understand what it's all about. He shook his head. Anyway, let's go, let's go, let's go. Need to show you something amazing. Alright, let me put away my things. 5 minutes later, Naruto was bouncing in front of the cabin while Elia and Ashara joined him. Taking both their hands, he started dragging them into woods. Where are we going? Follow me and I'll show you, he said, pulling them along. Finally, after a minute of being pulled through the forest, Naruto stopped, smacking himself in the head. Idiot, who, me, I can just do this, he said, turning to them with a grin. Both women suddenly felt the curious sensation of falling sideways, and all three stood somewhere entirely different. A pair of massive stone doors stood before them, inscribed with thousands of what both women recognized as seals. And now, ladies, Naruto said as the gates opened behind him. He grinned and walked backwards, holding his arms out. Welcome to my city. Elia and Ashara both stared with wide eyes as it dawned on them exactly what they were seeing. Far below them, nestled in between walls of tall stone, was a sprawling city, spreading outwards from a single tower in the exact center. They stared in shock at the gleaming buildings and paved roadways, scarcely having seen any city even halfway as impressive as this one. Gods, Naruto, Elia breathed, unable to take her eyes off it. You built all this. Me, clones and chakra, he said, grinning. It took a while, but I think I did an okay job. Okay, he says, Ashara mumbled, still a bit stunned. What would take the Lannisters and their ilk years to build, he just pulls from his backside. Obviously. Biwahaha, he laughed, and if Tywin ever learned about this, that wrinkly ass would try to make a bigger one just because he's jealous. Ha, both women managed a smile at that, even if Elia's was slightly more reserved. Naruto, he glanced over at her. Yeah, why did you make this? She asked, gesturing at the city. He subsided, and rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking a little embarrassed, as well as a bit guilty. A fallback plan, he said. A place that, if something dangerous ever happens, I can send you so that you'll be safe. Something dangerous. Ashara repeated, seemingly calm. And what, exactly, is that supposed to mean? Exactly what I said. Ah, she replied frigidly. So, in case a man in the street ever looks at us wrong, you have a nice little box to stuff us in until you're through saving the day. Naruto's eye widened. Wah no, he said, nearly panicking. That's not what I meant at all. Then what did you mean? Elia asked, waiting for him to explain himself. He took a deep breath. What I meant was, if there is ever something that poses an actual threat to me, I can send you here. They both raised an eyebrow despite themselves. Naruto, you are practically a god. What could threaten you? Ashara asked. Naruto gave her a sharp look, but let it slide for now, I don't know. And that's what scares me, he said, running a hand through his hair. Despite everything I've built here and everything I've managed to teach you, there's still so much I haven't seen. Not just here on this continent, or even on this planet. But, somehow, I know that there are things out there whose power I couldn't even fathom. He slowly sat down. Both women did the same beside him, listening intently. And if they ever decide to come here, nothing will stand in their way. That's what this place is for. He lifted a glowing hand and pressed it to the ground. Lines of energy spread outwards around them, illuminating seals that the ground was covered with. It took me 6 days to make the city. It took me 4.5 years to inscribe this entire place with every seal I could and power them all. Hell, my thumb is still sore from all the blood I had to use. I think it was worth it, though, Naruto said, smiling again. This is, bar none, the safest place in the world. Even if I ever managed to fully lose control of the Jubi and burn the rest of the planet to a cinder, this city would still be standing. And you built it for us? Elia asked, floored. He shrugged. And the Starks? Anyone I can save, really? Both women were silent for a long time afterwards. Then Ashara leaned over and wrapped her arms around his neck. Sorry, she mumbled. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I know how much you like to fight your own battles, he replied with a small smile. If you want to make it up to me, I have an idea of how. She pulled away, grinning. I think I do too, she said, running a finger along his leg. Naruto reached out and stopped her hand in its tracks. Tempting, but I was actually thinking of something else. They both turned to look at him, a little surprised. Oh, he gave a strained smile and seemed to age years before their eyes. There is really only one thing I can ask of you, he said, turning to look deep into both of their eyes in turn. Don't ever call me a god again. I hate it when people do that. Why? Elia asked curiously, shuffling a bit closer. We weren't exaggerating, Naruto. From what you've told us and what we've seen, it's an apt description. The ninja shivered and ran his hand through his hair. I've known far too many people who considered themselves gods to ever be comfortable being called one. Please, just do me this favor. Elia and Ashara glanced at each other. Slow smiles began to grow on their faces as they moved a bit closer to him. I think we can manage that, Elia said, leaning forward. And besides, I think it's the least we owe you, Ashara breathed, her lips close to his. So sit back and enjoy, Mr. Not a God. Because we're just getting started. Naruto walked back to the king's procession in rather a different mood than when he left. He nearly had a skip in his step. Elia and Ashara were two of the nicest ladies he'd ever met. Even some of the noblewomen in the north tended to be slightly on the aloof side. But those two, his smile got wider. Elia was relaxed and radiant, Ashara was bubbly and bright. They were two bright stars, shining every night. Their strength had impressed him from the moment he'd brought them north. Far cry from how I met those two, he said to himself, and just like that, his good mood turned to ash. Naruto shook his head. Bah, no use dwelling in the past. He resolved to think of happier things. But of course, his luck tended to be fickle. His sensitive ears twitched at the sudden shout from a familiar voice sounding from the nearby building. Shit, he muttered. Ned's pissed. Half a minute later, after entering the building and sneaking past a bunch of Lannister guards to discreetly see what was going on, he rolled his eye. Ned was there in front of his daughter, arguing with Robert over something Joffrey had done. Arya stood in midst of them, looking nervous and angry at the same time. Robert was sitting in a chair while a maester treated his broken nose. He looked very irritated at the whole thing. To his interest, Sansa was also there, standing in a corner. It didn't look like she'd been noticed by her father. The two he was most interested in were Cersei, who looked determined, and Joffrey, who was arguing with Arya. But Joffrey isn't telling the truth. Shut up. Enough. Robert roared, waving the maester off and interrupting the children. He tells me one thing, she tells me another. Seven hells, what am I to make of this? No one answered. Where's your other daughter, Ned? In bed, asleep. She's not, Cersei said, looking to where Sansa was standing in the background. The queen had nearly said nothing, as she honestly did not want to drag the sweet girl into this, but Joffrey would have hated her for the rest of her life if she did not. Sansa, come here, darling. The young girl came forward to the surprise of her father and sister. Naruto noted with interest Sansa's determined stance and Cersei's hesitant one. This could get interesting. Now, child, Robert said thickly, still talking through his broken nose, tell me what happened. Tell it all, and tell it true. It's a great crime to lie to a king. Sansa looked from the king to the prince, then to her sister and father and back again. And before their eyes, she closed her eyes, drew herself up and took a deep breath. What Arya says is the truth. All of it, liar. Joffrey yelled immediately. Those two attacked me, and that beast nearly killed me. That beast is barely bigger than a puppy. Sansa snapped back, and it wouldn't have attacked you if you weren't swinging a sword at my sister. Every person in the room raised an eyebrow at the fiery girl. Ned's eyebrows had climbed into his hairline, while a proud smile was on his face. Even Robert, who was used to simpering ladies of the South, couldn't help a small quirk of his lip. How you remind me of your aunt, little lady. Joffrey drew back as if he'd been slapped, his shock quickly morphing into rage. You bitch, he shrieked. How dare you lie to your prince? The Lord of Winterfell barely stopped himself from baring his teeth, while his oldest daughter had to stop his youngest from attacking the boy. Careful, boy, Robert growled. You might be my son, but that is the daughter of one of the greatest lords of the Seven Kingdoms you're insulting. She's lying. You're the one who's lying, Sansa retorted, starting to get really angry. But then, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Easy, sweetheart. It's not worth getting upset over this punk. The red-haired girl looked around to see a familiar blonde standing there, an easy smile on his face. Naruto. Everyone guard in the room tensed when they saw the young man appear from out of nowhere, while Robert narrowed his eyes. And what are you doing here, boy? He growled. Naruto glanced at him and chuckled. Still upset, I would think. The greatest warrior in the Seven Kingdoms would be less surly about a simple broken nose. Or are you just getting soft? Bah, Robert snarled. Were children not present I would beat you bloody for saying that. I'd like to see you try, old man, and anyway, your ability to take an ass kicking is not what we're discussing, is it? And what exactly do you have to contribute? Robert asked, rankled by the fact that Naruto probably could take him down very easily if they fought. Well, first, he said, his eye flickering over to Joffrey, who stiffened. Sansa and Arya have both told you what happened. 2 witnesses against 1. Family can be biased, Cersei said softly, only hesitating a little when Naruto looked over at her with a narrowed eye. Certainly they can, he replied. For example, parents can take their children's side, even when they know they're wrong. But we don't know, boy, Robert muttered. None of us were there. Speak for yourself, Naruto growled in reply. I saw the whole thing. Both Robert and Cersei opened their mouths to speak, but couldn't think of anything to say. Joffrey, on the other hand, was pale and sweating. And, what happened? Joffrey took out his sword and sliced the butcher's boy for no reason, so Arya hit him when he wouldn't stop, so he started swinging his sword like a lunatic. The little direwolf ran up to defend her friend and chomped on his arm, and I got tired of watching, so I stepped in. Cersei, listening to all of this, sighed in despair. She hoped beyond hope that Joffrey was telling the truth and that Arya was lying. Ever since the conversation she'd had with Naruto many weeks before, she couldn't help but notice the way her son acted with his younger siblings. One time she even had to step in and reprimand him after a particularly cruel comment to Myrcella. And the way he glared at her after, especially when he thought she wasn't looking. If Cersei was honest with herself, it scared her. King Robert looked at his oldest son, the one who would eventually inherit his throne, like he didn't even know him. You take a swing at Lord Stark's daughter, he whispered. You attack the child of one of my closest friends. The boy looked as if he were about to wed himself. The crime of striking any member of the royal family is usually imprisonment for life, Naruto said, interrupting Robert's train of thought before his rage could get any hotter. At his words, all 3 of the Starks present paled, while Robert and Cersei both looked at him like he was mad, and Joffrey managed to smirk, thinking things might go his way after all. That hope was quickly dashed. On the other hand, drawing a sword on a noble lady with the express intent of murdering her usually garners a harsher response. Namely, death, Naruto said, his eye darkening as he glared at Joffrey, who had gotten even sweatier than before. Since Arya was defending her friend and herself, I'm sure we can have a light punishment. Helping the Septa with her tasks for a day, perhaps. Eddard, Sansa and Arya all sighed, though the youngest seemed a little upset at having to deal with the stuffy old Septa. But everyone in the room flinched when the room suddenly got cold and a weight seemed to appear on their shoulders out of nowhere. Joffrey felt that weight more than anyone, feeling as if it would force him to fall to his knees. Your actions are beginning to grate on my nerves, little prince. Were you old enough to shave, I would happily drag you into a cell myself, he growled, the boy he was looking at struggling to stay standing. Your lofty rank, however, dictates a more imaginative punishment. Naruto stepped into the center of the room and commanded the attention of all those present. For the next 72 hours, you will remain on continuous watch with the Kingsguard, spar with them, and assist them in their duties. Everyone raised an eyebrow as Arya looked up at him in disbelief. Quote, Is that it? Not quite, he replied just as everyone was beginning to wonder what kind of punishment that was. The guard will constantly rotate to keep them fresh. You, on the other hand, will stay awake for the next 3 days and nights. And they are allowed to use whatever means they deem fit to keep you that way. The youngest people there may not have understood the true implications of the punishment, but Robert, Ned and many of the older knights there actually blanched. Each of them had been involved in battles or sieges that had lasted for many long hours, and after even a single day with no sleep, even ordinary tasks became tortuous. And for Joffrey to assist and spar with the Kingsguard, who went through more rigorous training than any knights in the entire 7 kingdoms. They shivered. That was just cruel. Now, off to bed, little prince, Naruto mocked. You'd best have a good sleep, because you start tomorrow at dawn. The boy looked as if he wanted to argue, but a quick glance at everyone there saw more than one of them glaring at him in contempt. His mother reaching for his shoulder and pulling him away was the final straw. He stormed out, trying to maintain some dignity. Cersei waited for a moment longer, before she glanced at Naruto. Seeing the way her shoulders slumped and the sadness and regret in her eyes, his own softened slightly and he inclined his head. He would need to talk with her soon. Something was bothering that woman, something beyond anything to do with her eldest son. Something deeper. The blonde turned around and smiled at the Stark girls, who both ran forward to hug him. "Thank you, Naruto," Sansa said into his chest, while Arya mumbled something unintelligible as she clung to his waist, but sounded similar. "No problem. It's always a pleasure to burst that brat's bubble," he said happily, and heard them giggling. "Anyway, you should go to bed. After all, Arya has a fun day with the Septa tomorrow." Her resulting groan had them all laughing. "Besides, I need to talk to the king and your dad for a little," he said, looking up at the elder Stark, who raised an eyebrow. "Ah, but I want to stay up," Arya murmured childishly, to Naruto's amusement. "You look like you can barely stand as it is, little wolf," he said affectionately, to which she growled half-heartedly, the day's events catching up to her. "Come on, Jory'll take you to your rooms." The man came forward, happy that everything had been resolved, and led the girls away. The guards began to clear out while Naruto and Ned stood there, the latter wondering what they were to talk about. Robert sat in his chair with his head in his hand, profoundly disappointed with his firstborn son. Thinking only of going to bed, he slowly stood up dejectedly and began to walk out. "Robert," came a sing-song voice from behind him. "We still have things to discuss." "The only thing I want to discuss right now is how much ale the innkeeper stores," he grumbled, so very tired of his little blonde friend. "Blondes everywhere. My entire kingdom infested with damn blondes. Is it something to do with the hair color?" "Robert," Naruto said, this time much less cheerfully. "We need to talk." "Ugh," he muttered as the door closed of its own accord before he could walk through it. He was so tired he didn't even spare the effort in being wary of Naruto's demon voice. He turned around and sat down in his chair. "What now?" he muttered, just wanting to get the damn conversation over with so he could go to bed. Naruto's eye twitched at how nonchalant his friend was being, but managed to take a deep breath. He stared at Robert and Ned seriously, one after another. "We need to talk about kings."